Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku faced the shadows of his past with Katsuki? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku Midoriya forgot the last time he appreciated partying with his friends, knowing he was a shadow who would rather be forgotten in the crowd than exposed to the most curious eyes. The atmosphere was welcoming at first sight, with this huge place probably rented for the occasion, and the loud music in the background. The song that caressed his ears was popular enough to be on the billboard, mixed with some timeless rhythm he had already heard thousands of times. He found himself mumbling a few of them with his plastic cup, his eyes observing the surroundings. The huge table with enough drinks tries to stuck him a few times, but he chooses to reject this tempting offer for the moment. His hand moved to the fabric of his pants, losing the tip of his fingers against his clothes. The shirt was oversized for his small body, but the style was enough to fit with the main theme of the party, exposing his naked shoulders and evident freckles. He blushed from embarrassment the first time he saw his reflection in the mirror, before being reassured by his friends, who gave him back a few compliments. Izuku accepted the compliment and went with this false promise of comfort, until the crowd faded away, leaving him with nothing but his thoughts and his useless applications on his phone. His fingers scrolled over the different choices of games, realizing how it'll be a long night and he'll definitely need to fit in the crowd at some point. His real self was pretty shy, passionate about his hobby, and a decent student. He never hesitates to help people who need help with their semester, a gesture usually rewarded by bonus points in his grades at the end of the year. The green-haired man brought this ounce of light in people's lives, thanking him for his kindness when a certain someone would have mocked their situation. However, Izuku Midoriya with his friend were different people. He didn't mind staying by their side, giving the impression of being a lost puppy despite their strong aura. Don't get him wrong, he was timid and making friends was a miracle, but he had a hard time convincing himself to make an actual move and leave his house to reach this place, with familiar faces, surprised to see him. He tried to make conversation with students he recognized from his classes, but it didn't last long, and he often left the shorter man alone with his thoughts. A sigh escaped from his lips and his eyes lost themselves in his surroundings. The house was now filled with more shadows with loud conversations and hidden laughter, while a minority were already making out in the closet. The familiarity of the song made him smile, reminding him of his childhood days when he used to mumble those lyrics with his old best friend. Nostalgia didn't make his heart less heavier than it already was, especially when things turned out in the worst way possible between them. It was natural for Izuku to miss this stupid grin, the captivating crimson eyes, and his golden spiky hair that brightened his days. In all honesty, he didn't have enough strength to delete the last pictures he got with his childhood friend, praying for the day when those conflicted feelings manifest themselves into a gesture strong enough to transcribe how much he missed their casual hangout. "Looks like you're already half asleep." A sudden voice crossed his attention, forcing the freckled man to lift his head and meet the brunette. Ochako Uraraka was the first friend he made once he reached university, after being Kaken's rival against his will. It was refreshing to meet new people, until they became familiar with this rise of novelty inside their chest. It was helpful for the freckled man to change his mind and have support from real people instead of ghosts of his past. The shorter man sighed, rolling his eyes and moving further on the couch, welcoming the brunette beside him. "Is it too late to return home? Maybe I can watch the last episode of my show. You know how I've waited an entire year to know what the villain's motive is," he complained with a sigh, hoping this trick would work on the shorter woman, but she only rolled her eyes in answer. Sheet, he wanted to use the emotional card to escape from here, but he was definitely stuck for the night, right? "Nice try, but it would be bad if we leave this early," she added with a nod. Don't get her wrong, Ochako didn't mind leaving this place too. After all, she got her girlfriend who returned to the campus after her last trip she was excited to get the reunion they deserved. Unfortunately, they needed to pretend until alcohol became a reason to leave. "As much as I hate being here, I would rather be in Himiko's arms than resting on this old couch." "How long are we going to play this role?" Izuku asked with a serious tone. He knew the brunette was the only one in the friend group who noticed when things were wrong. Between the exams and the constant pressure on their shoulders about their future, they rarely found a way to get some peace of mind. Sometimes Izuku and his close friends wondered if all those sacrifices were just errors that took too many years of their youth. We can use our fake smiles as long as we want, pretend to be interested in their conversations, but none will remember us at the end of the day. Fitting into a category to please the public opinion isn't the happy ending I want. Sometimes I envy the ones who have control of their own lives. It must be amusing to not fit into a role and be themselves. Are you talking about your relationship with a certain someone? Ochako asked with a teasing tone, leaving the couch to grab the closest cup within their reach. The green-haired man looked at her with a surprised expression on his face, being hesitant to grab the drink. Don't worry, this one is safe. The organizers were smart enough to separate the cup of water from alcohol and enjoy it while it lasts. I know Haruki is planning to get some messed up mix for the night. Izuku smiled and thanked her. His scarred fingers met the plastic cup until the border met his lips, and the fresh water fell on his throat, bringing an ounce of relief. His friend was right, he needed to enjoy this peace before being drunk enough to make late-night confessions he might regret later. If he stayed silent and simply checked the time on his phone, he couldn't forget the previous questions asked by the brunette, who probably needed an answer. To be honest, even Izuku didn't get the opportunity to solve this problem since he reached university, knowing this was supposed to end after graduation. Caring about some ghost of your past can be seen as a tricky way to waste his time, and the green-haired was tired of being the pawn of this cruel chess game. He knew how naive it was to hope for a change after the promises Katsuki and him when they were young, but time erased those tender words and transformed this affection into some kind of forced rivalry. If the golden-haired man wanted to use those precious secrets against Izuku to ruin his reputation, he would have done it a long time ago. It caught him off guard to see how his old best friend often put threats instead of actions, wondering if the stubborn blonde wasn't playing the same role as him in this fragile bond between them. If I ended up throwing in the garden due to some strange mix, make sure no one records me, he pointed out with an amused tone, making sure to not let any compromising videos or pictures spread on the internet. Being the center of attention was enough, he refused to have more pressure on his vulnerable shoulders when he could barely survive on his own. Sure, it would be pretty bad to see how the tough Izuku Midoriya is a sobbing mess when it comes to his childhood friend, she added with a punch to his shoulders, noticing the slight blush on his cheeks. They both remember this moment too well for Izuku's liking, but she kept the secret during his breakdown about his situation with his supposed rival and longtime friend, Katsuki Bakugo. She wasn't stupid and recognized how those fake smiles were replaced by genuine tears about some personal anecdotes concerning some past the freckled man cherished more than his own life. I'll keep this secret to my grave, only if you agree to not tell the group about my absence in January. I get it. I guess being in love and having his feelings returned is something worth ditching some stupid parties, he pointed out with a smile, making a discreet gesture to let her know how he'll keep the secret. He was here when the brunette was excited about her first relationship, some kind of complicated story similar to his, except for their happy ending. Izuku was glad to see how his close friend succeeded in gaining color back to her face after a cruel misunderstanding, but he couldn't thank Toga enough for making his friend happier than ever. He lost his hands against his messy curls, sensing the sweat on his forehead due to the heat of the room, until he realized how their group of friends had made a sign from the garden, inviting them to join the group. They're probably talking about the latest news that spread around the campus. Tell me, are you ready to be drunk until we pass out? I can't deny this offer, the brunette said with an amused tone, pinching his shoulder until their shadows left the living room to mix in the crowd. Little did they know how a pair of crimson eyes watched their shadows mixing with a bunch of people with an annoyed expression on his face. You're staring, Mina's voice echoed in the small space, catching the taller man off guard. The amusement in her voice was enough to distinguish how she jumped to the wrong conclusion and made everything more complicated than it already was. Her elbow punched the strong arms, which rested against the window with nothing but an empty cup in the palm of his hands. The taller figure succeeded in distinguishing himself from the other objects in the isolated room he knew by heart. It's none of your business, Katsuki mumbled with a grumpy tone. If he didn't say anything out loud, he chose to transcribe his jealousy through hidden gestures, significant enough for the ones who recognized this call for help. Mina Ishido might have known Katsuki Bakugo for a few years, but she succeeded in reading into him like an open book. This harsh behavior he exposed to the world was only a facade to cover his real self. He was nothing more than a student who liked to rewatch his favorite movies and pretend he wasn't hurt by the distance between his childhood friend and him. The pink-haired woman rested her back against the closest chair, letting the uncomfortable silence fill the previous conversation, knowing the blonde needed some time to deal with this situation. Everyone on the campus knows the obvious rivalry between Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo. Many whispers explain their story as something heartbreaking. The rumors explained how the two men, who couldn't stand each other, used to be best friends since their high school years. A sudden shift, some might say, feelings realization for others, and a minority theorizing it with the fear of being forgotten after graduation. It was none of their business, but the murmurs became a bother to Katsuki, who would rather shut everyone down with some threats and keep his reputation than admit out loud how much he missed the freckled man. After all, the nerd had always been this inspiring shadow who considered him as Huss' biggest hero, a title stronger than All Might. Izuku and Katsuki were the weird kids who didn't have any friends on their own, but refused to let each other go, even during their late-night sleepovers. Inko and Mitsuki liked to share the anecdote of those tender mornings when it was time to leave, and the two boys stayed together, holding each other close and pretending they were still sleepy. This invisible thread between them lasted a few more years, following them into middle school with their ups and downs, but things took another turn once they reached high school. It happened with slow hints until it became evident, and without realizing it, the two best friends became strangers to each other's lives. There wasn't any day passing by where Katsuki didn't miss the stupid nerd with his kissable cheeks and his baby face, but he simply accepted to take the role of the bad guy in this situation. A new chapter of their lives, and regrets the blonde kept hidden for too long inside his chest. It wasn't how Katsuki planned his life after graduation. Would rather use this supposed hate and rivalry to keep an eye on his childhood friend than let him go without the apology he deserves. It's none of my business, but aren't you tired of pretending? After all, there was no need to rush this conversation when it was Katsuki's decision to either continue this game or not. Mina didn't have bad intentions toward him, but she wanted to be the shoulder to cry on. This role you're playing to cover your genuine sentiments about this situation, are you sure you can handle it until the end? I'm not trying to bring you down, I just want to help you, Kats. If this comment was coming from a stranger, the blonde would have already kicked his butt, but it was different with Pinky. She might be annoying, but her intentions remained understandable, especially after being a spectator of this heartbreaking show from afar. If Izuku Midoriya was an angel everyone adored, Katsuki Bakugo was the shadow everyone despised. Their roles were distinct and their reactions remained a natural answer from this ethereal bond they broke with misunderstandings. I'm not asking you to steal the moon to let Midoriya know how sorry you are, but a simple conversation might be a good beginning. I know a bunch of spots in this house, you know where to find me if you need some help, she explained with a smile, putting her hands on his shoulders. Her eyes glanced at the figures from afar, standing in the garden with some familiar faces that always hung out with Midoriya, even if the freckled man wore his fake smile. His fingers held his plastic cup as a hint signal for anyone watching him from afar, asking for help. It was rare to see Izuku and Katsuki in the same party, but the freckled man seemed to have more difficulties with this kind of events, compared to his childhood friend, who easily fit into the crowd. What happened between Izuku and you is personal, and only you can understand the right choice to make to fix the situation. I don't like to see this heartbreaking expression on your face. Don't forget how your happiness matters, and even the scariest choices are also a sign for new beginnings, Mina added with a comforting tone, ruffling the spiky hair. The crimson eyes looked at her with an ounce of vulnerability, holding back his tears that'll probably never meet this broken skin, but she wanted to bring a positive message for the night. It was evident how no one would ever replace Midoriya, not after the longing expression on Katsuki's face and the way his hands held the cup with shaking fingers. However, the pink-haired woman didn't get her hopes too high tonight. deciding to change the blonde's mind and bring a smile back to his face. Most of the people here are already drunk enough to forget their own name. I doubt they'll realize how you've been there the whole time, the taller woman explained with an amused tone, taking the plastic cup away from the calloused hands. The taller figure sighed, explaining how he needed a few more minutes to follow their plan. Once he'll be done with his inner thoughts, he'll pretend to just arrive. Mina nodded and said she was ready to wait for his amazing entrance that would captivate all the glances until she left the door half open with Katsuki and his inner thoughts. The golden-haired man wasn't the kind of person to jump to the wrong conclusion, but this series of events in high school transformed the bond he cherished more than his own life into a foreign souvenir. Even if he wanted to, Izuku was already too occupied with his new friends, who would make him happier and be better people than Katsuki had been in the past. If the blonde knew the exact reason for this distance between them in high school, due to some revelations his heart couldn't accept back in the days, Izuku's motives remained unknown. Katsuki liked to think the nerd realized how being away from each other was better than tolerating their friendship. He missed hanging out with Izuku, watching series together, quoting each line from their favorite movies, and their competition to be All Might's biggest fans. Izuku would have collector editions of merch, while Katsuki multiples dedicated posters from their favorite actors, and this impression of being at home. He wondered if the freckled man often thought about their sleepovers and how afraid they were to leave each other in the morning, the long conversation about their future together, and their pinky promises. If the crowd knew about this vulnerable side of the unreachable Katsuki Bakugo, they would have treated him differently, but it was too late. Mina was right. He forged a strong reputation surrounded by whispers with words he didn't mean, instead of being his real self and making the first move. After all, he considered that being mean as a rival was better than being fragile by some confessions with a potential rejection. Falling in love with Izuku Midoriya was easier than breathing, especially when his green messy curls moved against his forehead and his cheeks brightened with a slight blush to show the form of his freckles, with this delicate melody of his laugh. Those scarred hands held the calloused ones during stormy nights, reassuring him with sweet promises of being his white knight, even if the nerd probably forgot about those frames of this precious past. He couldn't help but wonder how those reassuring lips, who shared so many vows until now, would feel against his. Were they as soft as they appear to the eyes, or more discreet and considered as a selfish treasure to cherish? In all honesty, Katsuki took a few years to completely accept the rise of new feelings inside his chest, being afraid at first, but he couldn't blame his younger self for the way he reacted, even if he wished Izuku and he would have done things differently. The more his crimson eyes lost themselves in the green curls from afar, the more he became nostalgic for a time he'd never get back. He recalled those same chubby cheeks praising him with wide emerald eyes and shining irises, brighter than the midnight sky above their heads. Katsuki was the kind of guy to hold onto the past which blocks him from making changes to his present lost inside his mind instead of his reality. After all, he might try as much as he wants, but this false role of rival will always take the lead. With a sigh, he left his secret spot and made a sign to the pink-haired woman, who guided him into a hidden path. Even if the entire crowd was stunned to see Katsuki Bakugo leaving his tavern, his crimson eyes didn't hesitate to meet the surprised emerald ones, almost like their glances shared some kind of indescribable message they couldn't understand yet. A few hours later, the beginning of this party, which resonated in the entire neighborhood, became quickly forgotten. The music became louder as the songs repeated themselves with the same melody that crossed Izuku's ears, mumbling some of the lyrics. He knew it was a bad idea to follow the group, but Ochako and him decided to take a shot to forget about their shitty lives and escape as soon as possible with a good excuse. It worked before and both of them knew their limits, which didn't stop them from staying half sober. If some people were already dead asleep on the couch and others occupied the rooms, a majority of them stayed in the big garden. The fresh air crossed his messy curls, laughing at bad jokes and keeping an eye on the clock, until the first games caught his attention. The freckled man stayed distant, observing the familiar faces being a source of distraction, with a certain mix in the cup, and the winner's title was discerned to the participant able to recognize the different alcohol. A bunch of people observed this show as the crowd applauded between each round, starting with something soft, to the strongest mix that transformed the most discreet soul at the start of the show. The least he could say was how the atmosphere differed from earlier, with the cheering from the shadows entertained by the multiple games. Some of them were lighter in order not to put everyone in an alcoholic coma. Izuku, for his part, simply stayed silent, being too focused on a certain someone standing in the landscape. How was he supposed to ignore his childhood friend, when their glances kept searching each other? Izuku wanted to believe it was a pure coincidence, a strange series of events that led to Katsuki being more drunk than usual, but his heart knew it was more than a simple assumption. He refused to jump to conclusions. Maybe the blonde was cursing his name from afar and it was all a fantasy inside his vulnerable mind. Izuku should use the previous drunks to take his courage and start the conversation, but he chose the silent treatment. The previous smiles exchanged in their past became a lost memory as their unreachable shadows stood there, with sad expressions on their faces. The freckled man sighed, deciding to take the last cup of water he and Ochako hid in the kitchen as a backup plan, until a sudden noise caught his attention. The emerald eyes focused on the table with a series of cups. He let his curiosity take the lead as he looked at the pink-haired woman appearing with a prideful smile, her arms wrapped around Kirishima's neck, obviously drunk. It was a miracle if they were both alive and awake at this hour after the previous show and participation in games, but Izuku admired how far they were ready to go before passing out. Alright, I think we've seen a lot of interesting things earlier, but there's a special one we kept at the end, Mina exclaimed out loud, trying to get everyone's attention. Everyone knows this treasure that is beer pong, and despite having some candidates in mind after the previous performances, we kept the best for the end. Izuku wondered what this famous surprise could be that deserved to be celebrated at this late hour. After all, he always watched people playing this game but had never been a participant, despite its amusing aspect. He wouldn't mind doing it without the reward at the end, but he was sure a lot of people wouldn't agree with his version. The breeze moved across his face, ruffling his delicate skin as his fingers held the cup closer to his chest, catching the lost glances on him. After all, it was strange to see Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya in the same place without starting some stupid fights. Their reputation precedes them, and it started as a meaningless event until it became a more serious topic. One conflict particularly impressed the gossip. It was stupid, based on an all-might quiz with unique questions that can be answered by experts only, but the two childhood friends fought for their lives. In the end, Izuku ended up getting this victory, but Katsuki took his revenge and this endless circle repeated itself until their current situation. I know a certain someone who's been pretty eager to make his proof, especially with a rivalry like his, but let's welcome the first participants, Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya, the red-haired man exclaimed out loud, receiving a thumbs up in the air from his girlfriend. Izuku's eyes went wide when he heard his name, thinking it was another hallucination. Scarred fingers held the plastic cup tighter, holding his breath as he looked around to see the confused expressions on the brunette's face. However, it became clear that he wasn't dreaming when his eyes met the crimson ones. His heart missed a beat when he realized how Katsuki was as stunned as him by the news, not being in the best condition to play a tough game like this one due to his physical condition. Yet, his fingers nearly broke the cup when he got enough courage to reach the end of the table, under the applause of the crowd. Don't get him wrong, Izuku would have never done such a thing under sober conditions. Come on, are you really afraid of losing against me without even trying? Where is the great Kaken who thought he would do everything way better than me? He said with a grin at the tip of his lips, surprising himself for this unexpected change. Usually, he would stay discreet and make himself forgotten, but he couldn't pretend he didn't want to have an interaction with his childhood friend, when he had wasted enough tears for these fateful moments. As heartbreaking as it was, their only way to communicate was through the use of public altercations, even if their narratives completely differed once they were on their own. To be fair, if the taller man refused to play this game, Izuku would have accepted it and stayed away from this kind of thing, but he couldn't go back. Izuku, you should probably step back and dash. It was probably the first time the green-haired man heard his supposed rival sharing considerations about his state, something he never done before. If Izuku felt a slight change in his heart, melting at the idea of returning to their golden years for a few seconds, he decided to play along with this persona he had never appreciated. See? He's ready to give up, he explained out loud, hearing the sudden gasp of the crowd around them. Great. The attention was now focused on the blonde and his hesitant face, realizing how he needed to calm this situation down. He wasn't in the mood to play this role for the night, especially after his conversation with Mina and his desire to change, but he was ready to use this card if it was his last option. I never thought you cared about me, especially when your lips are used to curse my name, but I bet you don't have enough ball to accept this ultimate fight. He never saw the freckled man acting that way before, and was sincerely concerned about his state. For his well-being, the blonde didn't want to participate and keep an eye on Izuku, but it was too late. He already saw some fucker he saw flirting with Izuku, and this sight was enough to bring him back the outrage he'd been looking for. His jealousy took the lead over his rational thinking, leading to chaotic decisions, but he had no other choice, especially when the freckled man seemed to return to this fake but role amplified by their previous drinks. Come on, are you really afraid of losing against me without even trying? Katsuki wanted to tell him to stop, to take some rest, but the words didn't succeed in escaping from his mouth. If they were supposed to hate each other, then why did Izuku's eyes express so much sadness? The blonde's heart arched at this realization, and he decided to move closer to the freckled man, hearing the whispers and future gossip around his name, but he didn't care. The only detail catching Katsuki's attention was the mesmerizing emerald eyes that held back too much pain, and one knew what would happen next. But Katsuki wished he had solved this situation under different circumstances. The calloused fingers met the freckled man's shoulders, catching the slight breath escaping from his lips at their close distance. An uncomfortable silence followed, to everyone's surprise, until the freckled man was the one to take the lead, even if it was touching to see someone he's supposed to hate care about his state. The craziest thing was how this interaction was better than the last years of hate they gave to each other. Where is the guy who thought he would do everything way better than me? He whispered in a low tone, moving his face closer to the blonde's. A sudden blush rose on his cheeks, realizing how he'd never been this close to his old best friend, and yet, Katsuki didn't stop him. Maybe Izuku could use his drunk state to justify the rising blush on his cheeks. Don't you dare dash. Oh, the big kaken is finally showing his teeth. Go make your proof. The winner will put an end to all those years of rivalry once and for all, deal? He put his scarred hands between their heated bodies, revealing a pinky finger that echoed bittersweet memories to their broken hearts. The crimson eyes widened when he recognized this familiar frame of those gentle promises that were supposed to be their new beginnings, under a stormy night, or after a magical kiss on the forehead after an injury. If this wasn't considered as a direct confession from the freckled man, the gesture was meaningful enough to their souls, who shared more secrets than anyone in the room. Izuku knew it was stupid to hold on to nostalgia, but he wasn't afraid of taking this risk if this meant bringing the old kaken back, the one who owned his heart and soul. Deal, but don't cry about it once I kicked your butt, the blonde exclaimed out loud with a grin, sealing their pinky promises under the applause from the crowd. If the others were more preoccupied with the meaning of this deal, indicating the winner of this conflict that had lasted for too long, Izuku and Katsuki stayed focused on the strange electricity between them when their skin met. It's been a while since they haven't felt such a thing, and yet, it was as mesmerizing as the determination in their eyes. I'm not afraid, but maybe you should, the freckled man whispered with a teasing tone, showing one of the rare smile he kept for his loved ones. Katsuki's heart missed a beat and ignored the blush on his cheeks, probably aware that the nerd already saw it, despite not making any comment on it. Pinky, start the game. I have to teach this idiot a good lesson about his bratty behavior, Katsuki exclaimed while the previous shadows stepped back to give some space to the two figures in the center of the room. If the crimson eyes glanced at the emerald ones, none dared to speak while Mina prepared the game and announced the rules. However, chills spread through the blonde's body when a whisper that caressed the blonde's ears. He needed a few seconds to realize how those words weren't the result of his imagination, but his reality, based on the evident blush and slight tenderness rising in the emerald eyes. Their close proximity didn't make the situation easier for their hearts, but it was touching to see how the old Izuku Midoriyawa still was there, even if his true self was hidden under strong layers. That's the kaken I know, was what Izuku said with a low tone, audible enough to be heard by the blonde, but erased by the wind. Their relationship was more complex than this illusion they shared with the public, but they didn't mind using every occasion to interact with each other. Each gesture actually meant something to their vulnerable souls, covered with false beliefs and hidden tears when no one was around. It was rare to see the two childhood men interact without throwing curses at the other, transforming this curious happenstance into a slight ounce of hope. The pink-haired woman finished her explanations while the crowd shouted the name of their team like some football match. Being the center of attention was a strange feeling, but they couldn't step back, especially when the stakes of this match would determine the winner of those useless fights. The emerald eyes left the crimson ones as his shorter man stepped back, when Mina gave him the first ball to start the game, ignoring the fast heartbeat inside his chest. He needed to stay focused on the actual game and make his proof. It was a first for him and his evident lack of knowledge, but he remained a good observer and succeeded in recalling some moves he saw in past parties. Picturing the actions inside his mind was very different from practicing them, but it was worth a try. A slight grin crossed the tip of his lips as he regained a sudden confidence, holding the ball tighter in the palm of his hand. He could feel the crimson eyes that never left his gaze, almost like the two men returned back from their childhood with their title to be All Might's biggest fans. Izuku held his breath and closed his eyes, focusing his glance on the scenery. The 10 cups seemed so far and yet so close to his shadow at the same time. It was easier to give advice than to stand there with nothing but anticipation on our shoulders, and a bunch of glances focused on each of his movements. The freckled man convinced himself that the first hit wouldn't be perfect, and his assumptions turned out to be right when he missed his chance. Some encouraged him for the next time while others booed at him until the taller figure replaced him and became the star of the show. The crimson irises stared at the emerald ones, annoyed by the confident expression on the blonde's face, especially when his speech was followed by some comment he could have kept to himself. Katsuki Bakugo was a tough rival when it came to competition, but it was harder to beat him once he became determined about something. Izuku Midoriya was ready to fight if necessary, and the golden-haired man might be famous for his skills at beating anyone in drinking games, but the freckled man secretly hoped he'd have this victory. The wind ruffled the sweat on the blonde's forehead as he positioned his hands at a good angle, ignoring the crowd from afar. Tonight, Katsuki was determined to kick Izuku's butt and put an end to this false mask of rivalry between them, even if this meant offering an unforgettable victory. A sudden cheer echoed from afar when the blonde got his first point, crossing his arms against his chest with a teasing grin on his face. Izuku ignored his glance, grabbed the cup, and took the shot without any regrets, realizing how he wouldn't let this idiot have this vicious face for too long. The tension between the two candidates became more intense with each failed attempt and stolen glance, as alcohol transformed this sense of competition into pure stubbornness. The shy Izuku Midoriya, who missed his first attempts at the beginning of the game, was now convincing enough to gain a few points and watch his childhood friend take the shots with an unimpressed expression on his face. Everyone cheered and supported their team, quickly highlighted by the background noises crossing their ears with the sound of the ball in the cups. However, the freckled man needed to admit how the blonde was scarier than ever when he didn't hesitate to let the other pay for his confidence, watching the shorter man offering a middle finger after each victory. The entire time, the emerald eyes stayed focused on the remaining cups near his reach. He refused to let this idiot take this title, and he immediately shouted a scream of relief after seeing the equal score. It was evident how both men were already wasted by the content of the cups, unable to have sober thoughts, and replied with constant middle fingers that strangely sounded like SXL tension between them. If some people noticed it, they decided to keep this assumption hidden and waited for the final round. The silence was at its height. All the eyes were fixed on the final cup residing in the middle of this table. Izuku's eyes stayed focused on the crimson ones, noticing how his heart missed a beat multiple times during the game when the taller figure was dangerously too close to him or his lips, but he decided to blame his lack of conscience for this. The golden-haired man smirked as he prepared himself, enjoying the attention of his childhood friend while whispering a slight tease, forcing Izuku to roll his eyes at the comment. He missed being this close to the man he loved, and yet, what a shame he needed to be in a messed-up state to make such a forgotten dream come true. "Are you ready to admit your defeat, Freckles?" he asked with a teasing tone, realizing how the shorter man moved closer. The gasps in the crowd crossed their ears, but none of it mattered when Izuku's breath resided a few centimeters away from his, with those captivating irises, ready to share thousands of secrets in a single glance. None dared to speak, with the SXL tension between them being the source of much gossip in the past, but it didn't stop Izuku from imposing his final threats. "I wouldn't be so determined if I were you. It's a question of luck, Kaken," he replied with a grin and stepped back with crossed arms against his chest. The tension in the garden was rising faster than Katsuki's heartbeat after the previous interaction, his fingers grabbing the ball closer to his palm and squeezing it tight, with a mocking laugh. He was the great Katsuki Bakugo and hasn't lost any of those shitty games in the past. It's not some nerd who'll have the privilege to steal this title. "We'll see about it." The answer was efficient enough to make the freckled man grin. Izuku had to admit how the blonde had a strong aura, with this charming smirk at the corner of his lips and those messy spikes on his head. In all honesty, it would be annoying to let such an a-hole like him take this final round, but the rules were already done and everyone wanted to know the big winner of this game. The next seconds seemed like hours, with the light music playing in the background, and every breath stopping for a moment. All eyes were focused on the small ball in the air, praying to have a chance with their previous bets, until the final sound echoed to their ears. The crowd gasped when they realized how the great Katsuki Bakugo missed his chance, giving this ultimate victory to his biggest rival. Izuku's eyes widened when he saw the taller man grabbing this shot with a middle finger to the cheer in the crowd, accepting his defeat under the stunned expression on his childhood friend's face. Many people congratulated the shorter man for his victory, noticing how the surprised expressions slowly turned into pride. His face gained color with an evident blush on his cheeks, with his scarred fingers holding the fabric of his shirt tighter and a fast heartbeat rising inside his chest. He couldn't believe how this desire to end this rivalry between them took a final turn on this fateful night. A smile drew itself on his lips as he felt the previous burden fading away, mostly due to the alcohol he had taken since the beginning of the game. Katsuki kept staring at him with an upset glance, but something inside Izuku's chest convinced him it was a relief for him too, almost like they should have been communicating about it earlier. A sudden joy rose inside his chest, and his eyes almost became teary at the idea that this stupid war was finally over. He moved closer to the blonde, ready to hear some comments about this stupid victory, and decided to let his heart take the lead for the first time. His body moved on its own to rush into the blonde's lips, shutting him down with a kiss, chasing after his mouth like a desperate soul who'd been looking into darkness for too long. The sudden gesture came out of nowhere, making everyone gasp at the unexpected revelations, and yet, it didn't stop the freckled man from losing his fingers into the golden spiky hair, holding it tighter to swallow this ethereal sensation against his heated body. In all honesty, he lost control of his thoughts and rational thinking a long time ago, and yet he had never felt so alive. He stepped back to regain his breath and immediately stared at the stunned crimson eyes, as red as the rising blush on his face. Izuku wanted to put the blame on his state, but he knew this kind of reaction differed from their casual interactions. At this moment, the reality slapped him in the face when he realized what just happened. He couldn't believe he rushed everything due to stupid romantic feelings and had his first kiss without the blonde's consent. Hidden tears started to appear on his cheeks as he mumbled a few apologies and ran away until calloused hands stopped him on the way. Izuku refused to look back and welcomed the tears falling down his skin and guilt rising inside his chest, knowing he had messed up. He tried to fight back but he naturally welcomed the taller figure moving closer to him, until his fingers lifted his chin. Emerald's teary eyes met the crimson ones, wondering if the blonde was mad at him for ruining this chance they'd both waited for years, and yet, the next gesture caught him off guard. His eyes widened when he felt the taller man wiping his tears away with reassuring thumbs before losing themselves in his messy curls and bringing the shorter man closer. His cheeks turned redder when he felt Katsuki shutting him down with an unexpected kiss, bringing his smaller body closer to his. Izuku didn't try to fight back and simply accepted the gesture, closing his eyes and welcoming his childhood friend's lips chasing after his. The sensation of heaven rising inside their chest was enough to drown their shadows in guilty pleasure, while the scarred fingers met the spiky hair and held them tighter. Their bodies became immediately glued to each other as their lips kept chasing after each other, fire burning their entire bodies as their hearts danced to this song they wished they'd known earlier. Katsuki kissed him like there was no tomorrow. Despite their sloppy attempts, their mouths succeeded in marking each other in the most possessive way. The freckled man held back a gasp when he felt their tongues meeting in rough movements, trying to melt into this pleasure, putting the blame on their drunk state. The golden-haired man knew he wouldn't be able to contain himself the moment he felt Izuku's lips on his own, and it was his duty to erase those salty tears from his cheeks. He never thought the nerd would be the one to make the first move or return his feelings, even if the two of them needed a serious talk about their actions being considered as drunk mistakes or echoes of new beginnings. Katsuki's body got chills when he felt the delicate thumbs of the freckled man meeting the exposed skin of his neck, ignoring the background noises. It felt so good to be loved and cherished by the man he chased his entire life. A selfish part of him wondered if he could stay in this dangerous dance for the rest of his life. The calloused hands moved from Izuku's back to meet his smaller waist, letting their clothes meet until he heard a slight gasp escaping the freckled man's lips. Izuku, with his eyes closed, welcomed this guilty pleasure rising inside his chest, melting at the strong and calloused hands wrapped around his waist, and refused to let him go. The green-haired man smiled, determined to let the other know how he was planning to stay if that's what Katsuki asked. Unfortunately, this heated encounter reached its end when both men regained their breath with a heavy blush on their cheeks. Emerald eyes met the crimson ones and their faces turned paler when they returned back to their reality. The previous music that followed them in this unexpected confession was quickly followed by slight whispers and pale faces in the crowd. If the two men had a hard time realizing the important damage it would cause to their relationship and reputation, it became a scary reality when Izuku's eyes met Ochako's, who let him know how he messed up. Don't get her wrong, she was supporting him with all her heart, but making out in public was not on her list of potential moves her friend could have done. An awkward atmosphere suddenly filled this sudden blank when both figures regained their breath. The crimson eyes looked at the emerald ones, who seemed lost at first sight but owned this natural beauty. It was evident how the two childhood friends needed time to accept what had just happened, but a selfish part of them was relieved to show the campus how they've always been each other's priorities, even if their feelings were hidden through fake rivalry. Izuku and Katsuki stepped back with a distant glance, until their figures disappeared on the opposite side, hoping the rest of the campus would forget about it. A few hours later, the frame stayed stuck inside his tormented mind, highlighted by the desperate calls for help from his heart. As much as he hated to admit it, Izuku couldn't help but think about what happened earlier as his cup was now filled with water. He would never thank the brunette enough for letting him know how he needed some rest after this crazy experience, and explain what happened with sober thoughts. The hesitant gestures of his thumbs against the plastic reflected his overthinking, probably considered as a strange dream too good to be true, but the familiar sensation on his lips was too real to be the result of his imagination. His reason blamed him for ruining everything with a simple gesture like this one, but his heart found some comfort in the mutual desire that resided in Katsuki's loving glance. After all, if the blonde was disgusted by his previous gesture, he would have never returned this drunk kiss that happened by coincidence. The last notes of the song crossed his ears until another one started, repeating this endless circle. His emerald eyes glanced at the table standing a few meters away from him, with a bunch of half-empty bottles, half-empty and messy cups on the wooden surface. He glanced at his phone to see the late hour, until he moved his head to meet the brunette sitting beside him. Ochako had been the first to rush after his messy drunk games, asking him if he was all right, even if he definitely needed help. The hidden tears resided at the corner of his lips until she brought some tissue and welcomed the shaking figure with his mumbles, explaining how they'd solved this situation. A few hours passed by and the freckled man was now in a state to offer a better answer, even if he felt uncomfortable at the curious glances around him. Many shadows ignored him, while others simply congratulated him for the game and how he wouldn't escape from this mess. "Looks like you're in a better mood for a talk," she pointed out with a sigh, resting her back against the couch and trying not to be louder than the music. She noticed how the scarred hands met the fabric of his pants, a sign of anxiety the freckled man used too many times in the last hours. I should probably ask what crossed your mind earlier, but if the topic is too harsh at the moment, you can mention it later. But ignoring its existence and the consequences of your actions won't make this easier for either Bakugo or you. She was right, and Izuku hated to admit it. He needed to take responsibility for what he did, but he didn't even know if his childhood friend would forgive him for this mistake. He effed up in the most chaotic ways, and yet, he was unable to bring the answer the brunette needed. The freckled man simply sighed and took a glimpse at the taller figure from afar, standing with his group of friends with arms crossed against his chest and distant eyes, almost like he seemed preoccupied with something else. "I never planned any of this," he mumbled in a low tone, taking his courage to finally speak about it. It would be hard but necessary if he wanted to fix this situation. In all honesty, he didn't even know if he was ready to be in a romantic relationship after these rushed confessions that ruined all his plans, or kept this fragile bond between them. In the euphoria of the moment, I was glad to see this ridiculous war finally over, and my body moved on its own. I felt bad for acting in a selfish way, but it became messier when he returned the gesture. "Tell me, why do I always have the talent to embarrass myself?" "It's something you need to figure out on your own, but you have bad luck when it comes to certain circumstances for sure," the shorter brunette teased with a slight smile, trying to erase this sad expression on her friend's face. Don't get her wrong, she was aware of the complexity of this situation, but she would be as lost as he if the roles were reversed. If Ochako got the chance to reciprocate her feelings, it was more complicated for stubborn souls like Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo, who considered sentiments as a topic to avoid despite their existence. To be honest, I'm not surprised to see this kind of reaction, especially after the endless gay panic you've made and the alcohol in your blood. You weren't thinking straight, and still, you let your feelings speak louder than words. That's a soft way to interpret this drunk kiss, even if I'm convinced a bunch of people won't be convinced by this explanation, including Kakens, he whispered with a low tone, looking at the golden-haired man from afar. There wasn't any day passing by where he regretted their golden youth and stolen laugh by the wind, with their endless sleepovers and pinky promises that were meant to last until death do us part. Time was pretty cruel when it came to growing up and transforming a strong bond into a fragile one, where a single mistake could ruin years of effort. This situation was a complete mess since the beginning. We should have never been rivals with a forced spirit of competition when we know the deepest secrets about each other's lives. It's like asking the closest person in your surroundings to hate you for no reason instead of fixing things. It doesn't make any sense. At least you acknowledge it, even if you took some radical actions, but it doesn't take away your sincere motivation to gain his trust back, Ochako affirmed with an understanding tone, noticing how the emerald eyes never left the taller figure from afar, even when the border of his water cup met his lips. "I don't and will never know Bakugo like you do. It's none of my role to force a decision on this complex relationship between the both of you, but it's my duty to help a friend dear to me. Tell me, aren't you tired of letting stupid misunderstandings and wasted time interfere with this happy ending? How long will you wait until one of you makes the first move, or are you simply stuck to be a shadow in the background and regret your actions once some strangers replace you by Bakugo's side?" Izuku always avoided that kind of question until now, afraid of their direct answers that might hurt his ego, but he went too far. The interrogations highlighted by the brunette implied a certain future where their figures would be nothing more strangers in the crowd, making their own lives and moving on with the years. The freckled man was convinced that his heart would always look for his childhood friend, no matter if this replacement was a carbon copy of his physical appearance or personality, but it would never be the same stubborn man who haunted his mind since his younger days. "Is that what you really want?" Ochako asked, convincing her friend to brave the forbidden for once. She understood how scary it sounded, especially for the outcome of this journey, but there was no doubt that Katsuki Bakugo was also calling for help from afar. His crimson eyes became more troubled since the game, something he would have never exposed to the public glance unless it was something that meant a lot to him. "The final choice is all yours, but don't let these remorses and regrets take away the last ounce of hope that kept you alive until now. Falling for nostalgia isn't the ending you deserve. Sometimes it just takes an ounce of courage to trust the unknown and get the new beginning you've wished for. I'm pretty sure Katsuki wouldn't mind having you back in his life, but the real question is, do you feel ready to take the risk?" As much as I want to change things, I have no idea where to start, Izuku admitted with a sigh, resting his back against the couch. He closed his eyes and made the mistake of picturing his heated encounter with his childhood friend. Scarlet colors crossed his freckled cheeks, took another shot of water, and stared at the scars on his used body. He recalled those days when the stubborn blonde used to heal his injuries and complained about him being clumsy, until he couldn't offer a proper explanation about the new scars on his fragile skin, under the heartbreaking crimson eyes. The freckled man appreciated Ochako's support, but he was completely lost. How should he start the conversation, introduce the topic, or even get to the point without being a blushing mess? If only he got a single hint from fate, a slight push convincing him to get this unique occasion, it would be easier. It's easy. You were at Bakugo's place. What would be the first thing you would have liked to see? She simply asked with a curious tone. The question left the shorter man off guard, taking some time to think about it. At this moment, a bunch of frames crossed his mind. A familiar child with golden spiky hair hanging out with his best friend and sharing secrets. There was no doubt their younger selves would have been disappointed to see how things turned out, but maybe there was a way to put an end to this hell by using the same charm that drowned Izuku in this mess: nostalgia. An explanation, especially when it came out of nowhere, he mumbled in a slight voice, trying not to get caught by the wind. The breeze moved his messy curls as he pictured the two children playing in each other's room, promising a bright future. The simple representation of his younger self watching the fragile state of their relationship broke his heart, especially when he held onto their pinky promises. This decision was rational enough to put everyone on the same equality, with the freckled man expressing his truths and the blonde making his final decision to either give up on him or start on a better basis. I'm not naive, but knowing Kakin, he's probably cursing my name from afar. I stole a moment that was supposed to belong to someone else. Maybe you get the wrong assumptions, but the only way to figure this out is to check by yourself. She added with a reassuring tone, putting her fingers on his shoulders. Their glances met the crimson ones, who immediately turned their head. If the brunette was secretly touched by the scene, Izuku realized how he couldn't stand those misunderstandings. You mean having enough courage to start the conversation? I can't even if you pay me 1,000,000 yen, he pointed out with a groan. Don't get him wrong, accepting this statement was already a huge step, but maybe he deserved to live this life and pay the price for this potential second chance he ruined by drunk mistakes. However, it didn't stop him from letting the tip of his fingers ruffle the hydrated lips, wondering if he would revive this intense sensation in his next wildest dreams. Even if this means finding a final ending to these wasted years and saving a friendship you care about? The shorter woman asked with a grin, knowing the answer and using her strategy to let the others see things differently. It was painful to imagine some strangers stealing this role that was supposed to be his, even if Izuku's inner jealousy wouldn't stop him from glancing at the other shadows who'd moved too close from the taller man to his liking. It's not like he deserved to have a word to say when it was Katsuki's choice to move on with the first person crossing his path or OBT, but the freckled man was scared at the idea of missing this second chance. He longed for this moment, and when it finally happened, he lost control of the situation and felt guilty about choosing selfishness over respect. His fingers were losing grip on his clothes and his eyes were losing themselves on the taller man from afar. The pink-haired woman, who talked with him earlier, left a few minutes ago, giving him the perfect occasion to make a move. In all honesty, Izuku was terrified by the idea of messing things up a second time, but he cared too much about his precious bond with his childhood friend to let the blonde go in the blink of an eye. It might be the biggest fight of his life, but it was worth the try. Alright, you got a point, but if this doesn't work, I'll convince Himiko to let you watch Sinister, he pointed out with an amused tone, taking this slight victory when the brunette's face turned paler. It was none of his intention to scare her, but the freckled man wanted to let her know how she'd have to pay for this if things went wrong. You know I can't handle this movie, she complained out loud, catching the attention of the crowd, but she only made a middle finger when she realized how Izuku was already out of reach. Sheet, Ochako might try her best to be the bridesmaid at his wedding, but the freckled man better assume this sudden confidence, or they'll both suffer together, to different degrees. How was he supposed to keep this to the public's eyes, when his mind was occupied by the addicting lips that crossed his a few hours ago? Katsuki Bakugo was rational about a few topics and wouldn't hesitate to admit his wrongs when it was the case, but the relief he was supposed to feel transformed into sadness inside his shattered heart. The calloused fingers held his cup tighter, staying distant in the conversation and barely interacting with the extras who mentioned how it must be nice to have Midoriya's favor. None of them knew about Izuku's deepest secrets and fear of abandonment, nightmares about an absent father, and how his shaking body felt too fragile inside the blonde's arms, despite being the same age as him. The blonde didn't have any special knowledge about their sudden breakup, but he always tried his best to be the shoulder to cry on when the nerd felt too overwhelmed. He was there after receiving a late-night text about Izuku's insecurities about being alone for his birthday. He stood by his side with the cake he bought at the closest shop and some candles, until the tears on the porcelain skin became reassuring smiles on the other's lips. The golden-haired man knew probably way more about Izuku Midoriya than those extras who claimed bullshit out loud, but he considered these unique skills as his biggest strength and weakness. Spending his entire life with his childhood friend helped him to read each expression on the nerd's face, from his hidden glances that transcribed his doubts to the shining irises being brighter than a midnight sky. However, the confused emerald eyes looking at him at the moment reflected a common misunderstanding. The best way to solve this problem was to have a proper talk, but neither of them would find the right time to take this huge step. If you keep looking like a sad cat, you'll get gray hair in your 30s, cats, the pink-haired woman affirmed with a grin at the corner of her lips, ruffling his spiky hair until a groan escaped from the blonde's lips. The taller man rolled his eyes and stepped back, resting his body against the closest wall to get some rest. He wasn't mad at Pinky for checking on him, especially when she knew how he was acting differently since this drinking game. Mina did apologize a few times, explaining how she should have known better about the consequences of this unexpected invitation, but even if Katsuki forgave her, he didn't express himself about this series of events that changed the stubborn soul into a distressed one. "It wouldn't be worse than it already is," he replied with a sigh, taking a sip from his half-empty cup, realizing how his drink gave him a bitter taste on his lips. He didn't even know why he accepted this offer, but he wanted to drink until he forgot about his false assumptions, which would eventually lead him to make a terrible decision. To be fair, he wouldn't mind making bad choices from now on if this meant stopping this bitter sensation inside his chest. "But you're too young for that, and I bet Midoriya also liked them with the way he squeezed them earlier," she teased with a smirk, punching his shoulders until the taller man replied with a middle finger. The comment brought a slight blush back to Katsuki's cheeks, hiding these rising colors with another sip beside the unimpressed expression on the woman's face. Mina didn't mind teasing him, but she admired how her friend was acting like a teenager who got his first crush. Technically it was the case. The great Katsuki Bakugo didn't have any other interest than his childhood friend since they were brats, and this romantic affection followed him until college, which was pretty surprising. After all, it would be a lie to say Katsuki wasn't a good-looking man, and the numerous requests to have a date with him on casual Wednesdays became a routine, but it was painful how this fake role became his biggest weakness at the same time. The blonde was someone who needed time to protect his emotions, was afraid of rejection, and needed a shoulder to cry on. Unfortunately, he found himself longing for the nostalgia of seeing those emerald eyes looking back at him with genuine care like in the old days. "Seriously, Cats, I care about you, and it broke my heart to see you running away from happiness. If there's anything I can do to cheer you up, I would immediately do it," Mina exclaimed. She hated this terrible vision of the stubborn blonde being so terrified of the unknown when he could have everything he ever wanted if he simply asked. This harsh behavior was only the result of an act to please the public, unaware of his hidden insecurities behind his threats. "I don't really know how to deal with this situation," he confided with a sigh, closing his fingers inside his golden spikes. The blonde felt the heavy sweat against his skin, but he secretly thanked the breeze for bringing some fresh air and calming down the fast heartbeat inside his chest. His free hand held the cup as a vulgar occupation to change his mind as he took a quick glimpse at the freckled man, sitting on the couch with round cheeks, probably talking about things that were none of his business. He was envious of this proximity between them, remembering how it used to be his place. He missed being the source of Izuku's smile, hidden laugh, and light blush on his adorable chubby cheeks. The only one to blame for this change was himself. Their high school years had been more than perfect according to his memories, with their late-night escape to talk about a future they projected together, hidden embraces under the sheets after some nightmares, and late-night confessions that only their skins remember. He didn't even reject the idea of this previous kiss being the result of drunk mistakes. After all, who would ever like to spend time with a harsh person like Katsuki Bakugo and be emotionally invested in a relationship with him? His heart only beat for his childhood friend, and feeling Izuku's lips against his was a dream come true, which explains why he naturally replied by letting him know how it was mutual. The blonde waited his entire life to make such a thing happen, and this didn't stop him from enjoying the euphoria of the moment, especially with the man he chased for too long. He wasn't even bothered by the victory owned by the nerd. This idiot might get all the victories he wanted in every single game, but he would never beat Katsuki when it came to love. The stubborn blonde was ready to take the world down for a glimpse of his smile, feel those delicate fingers around his spiky hair a last time, and wipe how much he missed being this close to the person he missed more than anyone. However, Katsuki had no other choice but to convince himself that it was probably the last time he would feel Izuku's lips against his, have this warmth able to chase every nightmare, and be kissed by the love of his life. Based on Izuku's reaction, it was clear that the shorter man probably felt guilty after his actions. The crimson eyes even noticed the hidden tears in the corner of his eyes, almost like he immediately regretted his actions. How stupid was he to even think someone like Izuku would ever love a harsh personality like Katsuki? It wasn't the first time he'd seen drunk people committing errors they regretted the next day, but he never thought that his biggest dream would turn into a complete nightmare. I only replied because I thought it was mutual. He was the one to break the boundaries and I let my heart speak for itself, but each time I picture his stunned face, I have the impression of ruining everything. Maybe he didn't mean any of this and it was all in my head, he confessed with a heartbroken tone, losing his glance at the light scars that resided on his skin. The only person who knew about their existence was Mina, who asked out of curiosity one day and learned about their touching history. It all started when Katsuki and Izuku hung out together in a park during a summer day, minding their own business until their activities were ruined by an intruder. The freckled boy immediately hid himself behind the blonde's back, explaining how he was afraid of big and mean dogs like this one, and Katsuki, as the bravest hero, decided to take his defense. Little did he know how this rival ended up leaving a scar on his skin, reminding him of his failure, and yet, the most tender souvenirs. He never shared the rest of the story with Pinky, but he loved the tender sight of the big teary emerald eyes looking at him with pride, and giving magical kisses to heal his injury as soon as possible, explaining how he was his biggest hero. Call him stupid, but the taller man was ready to sacrifice his own life to go back to this dynamic between them, where innocence and naivety guided each of their thoughts. There's only one way to figure this out, the pink-haired woman added with a slight smile. Mina might be the only one to know about the blonde's sensitivity when it comes to his childhood memories, but it broke her heart to see him drowning in a river of false assumptions. It wasn't her role to interfere with Izuku and Katsuki's relationship, but she noticed the way the emerald eyes often looked after the crimson ones when no one was looking, with the same expression, filled with sadness. I'm not strong enough for this, Katsuki mumbled in his beard, fully admitting his defeat. He didn't even fight back when the taller woman gasped at the previous comment, taking the cup away from his hands. Once again, the blonde was ready to make a stupid decision to change his mind, but it was her role to stand by his side and keep an eye on him. However, Mina moved closer to the blonde and punched his shoulders, trying to get his attention back. At this moment, something inside her chest broke at the sight of Katsuki staying silent with his exhausted expression on his face. It wasn't the inspiring figure she learned to know through the years, the one determined enough to stand up as long as possible for his goal, and follow a perfect rhythm during the exam to have the best grades. Kats, would you rather give up on your chance to get Midoriya's heart and attention for the rest of your life, and let some stranger steal this role that was supposed to be yours? She simply asked with a serious tone, noticing how the blonde listened to each of her words. Luckily for him, having a friend like Pinky was enough to open his eyes and realize how he needed to fight back. The simple idea of projecting some extras and spending the rest of their lives with his childhood friend, being the one on the altar and stealing his place, made his jealousy boil. He needed to fight a little longer instead of being defeatist at the slightest occasion and let the nerd understand how he wouldn't mind standing by his side, even if their path were meant to be separated at some point in this journey for unknown reasons. Don't you think you've suffered enough and deserve to end this conflict inside your chest? Mina's words acted like a slap in the face. Katsuki couldn't believe he almost gave up on his biggest dream when he had a promise to keep to his younger self. After all, he might not have Izuku by his side, but the freckled man deserved to know how sorry he was for forcing this distance between them. The freckled man might have his wrongs in the story, but Katsuki was tired of running away and needed clear explanations after the previous kiss they exchanged, which was their first and potentially their last. The pink-haired woman smiled when she realized how the blonde regained color to his face, ruffling his spiky hair with a touching gesture to not pressure him. The taller man would usually make an annoying comment, but he didn't fight back when Mina offered a slight smile at the corner of her lips. "Come on, go get your man and prepare me an invite to the wedding," she teased with an amused tone as she moved away. Katsuki only replied with a middle finger, hearing a laugh from afar while being on his own with his thoughts. At this exact moment, he realized how he couldn't step back, not when the younger Izuku would have been heartbroken to see the state of this golden string between them. None of them deserved this treatment, and yet, Izuku and Katsuki remained vulgar shadows in the crowd, with a narrative forgotten throughout the years. The taller man rested his back against the walls, losing his fingers inside his spiky hair, and released a groan. His heart was beating faster inside his chest as the frames of the drunk games crossed his mind, bringing a slight blush to his face. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't even notice the background noises fading into regular footsteps as someone walked toward him in hesitant movements. His crimson eyes only noticed the presence of the stranger once he opened them and lifted his head, meeting the shy emerald ones. A few whispers could be heard from afar, but the taller man ignored them as he stayed focused on the current situation with Izuku Midoriya, the man he had chased for so long, who was standing in front of him with his stupid freckled cheeks and the scarlet color on his skin. A quick glimpse was enough to notice the anxious scarred fingers against the fabric of his shirt, wondering what was crossing the nerd's mind to be this hesitant instead of mocking his childhood friend for being too naive. "Kaken, I know this isn't the right timing, but can we talk?" he asked with a soft tone, acting like a teenager ready to confess for the first time. It was different in this situation, where the two men were old enough to make proper decisions and pay for their consequences, no matter if they were negative or positive. However, there was something touching about the natural chemistry between their two shadows, connected by an invisible string to the most curious eyes, but evident to their sight. Seeing his childhood friend making the first move for the first time in a year was considered a blessing at this point, but Katsuki decided to hide his joy with a casual grin, which definitely brought a reader's shade to the other's adorable cheeks. Katsuki had no other choice but to accept the proposition, wondering if their fragile bond would know a certain revival or fall apart after this conversation. Izuku Midoriya never thought he would stand in front of the man he loved with his weakness exposed to the public crowd, but he already ruined his reputation, so he has nothing to lose. He wasn't ashamed to let the campus know about his romantic feelings for his childhood friend, but he was more afraid of rejection and disgust. Maybe Katsuki wasn't interested in a relationship or didn't feel the same way at all, and their previous kiss was nothing but the mistake of a drunken night. It wasn't a theory to exclude from his reasoning, but he needed to take his courage and start this conversation. "Take the lead," Katsuki announced with a calm tone, understanding how this circumstance might be difficult for both of them. After all, it was the first time they were having a proper interaction without being drunk or wearing this fake mask. For a moment, Izuku and Katsuki had the impression of being reunited with the comforting frames of their younger selves, who trust the other more than their own lives. I would love to, but not here," he whispered, low enough to be heard by the taller man. The scarred fingers played with the fabric of his long shirt under the exposed vision of the crimson eyes, who accepted the hints sent by the shorter figure. The emerald eyes looked at him with a soft glance after realizing how his childhood friend had read the previous signals, being more efficient than any words they'd exchanged until now. It was understandable, especially when they already had too much pressure on their vulnerable shoulders and felt suffocated by their surroundings. The main problem was how none knew the location of this room, and Pinky was already too far from Katsuki to give him the secret spot she had, leaving the blonde with nothing but false confidence. Maybe he should be honest and announce how he didn't know this house at all, or try to impress his childhood friend by sending him to the perfect spot on the first try. After all, he had nothing to lose and sent a simple glance at the shorter man, letting him know how he got his back while their shadows disappeared in the crowd. Most of the students were shocked, while others simply took a sip of their drink, minding their own business. Izuku's heart missed a beat when he realized how he was standing too close to Katsuki, reminding him of their previous kiss and wondering if the blonde was ready to hear his version of the story. His freckled cheeks turned redder as he naively followed the taller man until they had nowhere to go. Katsuki made a slight groan when he realized how they were stuck. Izuku was still standing by his side with scarred fingers ruffling his shirt, and the light above their head exposing the freckles on his shoulders. The blonde was ready to admit his defeat until he finally found a more hidden spot. His hands met the scarred ones, who immediately interlaced with his as their shadows faded into the darkness. If Izuku's face was red due to the sudden touch, Katsuki tried to regain his breath as a smirk crossed his lips at the hidden area standing near their reach. It wasn't as luxurious as the rooms of the huge house, but it was comfortable enough to be in their own bubble. The scenery reminded them of some fantasy setting, with the glasses on the wooden walls, slightly open to let some fresh air pass through this secret place. Some vegetation could be distinguished as a bench covered with a light pillow on one side and a blanket in the center. The crimson eyes widened when he discovered the private space, wondering if this was what Mina had mentioned at the beginning of the night. The blonde felt the scarred fingers holding his tighter, forcing the taller figure to turn around and meet the most breathtaking expression on Izuku's face. It's been a long time since the two of them stood so close to each other, and yet, Katsuki found himself mesmerized by the shining emerald eyes, reflecting the midnight sky that appeared outside the window, almost like Izuku was returning back to his curious roots. Katsuki noticed the way Izuku's lips slightly opened to release a slight breath until a scarlet color crossed his cheeks. If the two figures stayed silent, their eyes immediately noticed their interlaced hands and stepped back against their will, missing this previous comfort. Izuku's fingers found the back of his neck, making an awkward look until he interrupted their previous blank. "This is prettier than I expected. The owners must consider this place as their cocoon. It's a miracle if we found it before the other. I'm pretty sure we're alone now," he said with a slight smile, noticing how the taller man simply nodded. It was strange to stand so close and so far from each other, when they literally broke their boundaries a few hours ago. Indeed, the two men were ready to face the hardest part, hoping for a happy ending instead of a heartbreaking one. "I think we should take a seat," Katsuki added in a low tone, taking a glimpse at the endless sky reflecting through the windows. It was impressive how this precious spot was found by their tormented souls and reminded them of their secret escape during their youth. Maybe this ounce of déjà vu and nostalgia will be in their favor for the rest of the night. At least Katsuki crossed his fingers. "You go first," Izuku pointed out with a slight smile at the corner of his lips, exposing his scarred fingers to the distance between them. The gesture was refined enough to stay discreet about his intention of putting his childhood friend at ease, and see if the blonde was ready to talk about heavy topics. It was scary for the freckled man to open his heart, and he had no idea about the way he'd justify his drunk kiss, but he couldn't give up. The golden-haired man was the first to move from his previous position to reach the bench. He made sure not to bother the cozy space with his presence, by moving closer to the huge rounded glass, until his eyes followed the shorter man from afar. Izuku decided to join him after the previous interaction they exchanged, recalling the old days when they could spend hours talking about their hobbies and projects without any curses or threats, which unfortunately became their new everyday. Katsuki Bakugo authorized himself to break his vulnerable shell once he was alone with his childhood friend, knowing he didn't need to pretend anymore, not when those captivating emerald eyes were sharing thousands of truths at the same time. Izuku Midoriya was a shadow like the others, forgotten with time, and yet described as living with his natural beauty. He was the target of many propositions for a date, offers he rejected knowing his heart only belonged to his old best friend, and the same man standing a few centimeters away from him. During a few minutes, he had the impression of being a younger version of himself, holding a pillow between his knees and looking with pride at his lifetime companion. He dreamed about this reunion too many times to realize how it became his new reality, especially with the slight lamp standing on the wooden base, giving the impression of being closer than they were before. The setting was relaxing enough to have a clear peace of mind, transforming their presence into small dust in this universe, ready to share their narratives in the next decades. If Izuku's face turned softer at the realization, he simply put one of his curls behind his ears, before taking a quick glimpse at the taller man, who welcomed a slight blush on his cheeks. There wasn't a universe where Katsuki Bakugo didn't fall in love with Izuku Midoriya, and this one wasn't the exception to the rules. How was he supposed to continue his life knowing he was facing the most breathtaking painting he had ever seen, with those delicate shades of red coloring his porcelain skin, covered by the opacity of the night? What surprised him the most was the beauty of those emerald irises, reminding him of the most precious treasure he should cherish and keep away from the most vicious spirits. Katsuki Bakugo fell in love with his childhood friend for the second time, but had no idea how his sentiments were mutual. This moment, as genuine as it was for their tormented souls, reflected this unique bond that stayed alive this entire time, covered by some unjustified hate toward the wrong fights. Standing there in this dreamy scenery with the man he loved was everything Izuku ever wanted, even when he felt himself falling for his old best friend without an ounce of regret. So, how do we start this kind of conversation? I've never been able to do this sheet, even with the extras, so don't think you're the exception. Once again, Katsuki decided to use his teasing card to fill the previous black between them, even if his heart missed a beat when Izuku smiled back at him. Sheet, the freckled man had no right to be this gorgeous. It should be considered as a crime to let his natural beauty be exposed to the most perverted eyes. That's sweet of you to take my feelings into consideration, but I don't either. I just hoped you'll be the one talking now you're sober, the shorter man whispered with a soft tone, resting his head against the pillow he grabbed earlier. If Katsuki stayed distant from touching any object, probably due to his worries of messing things up again, Izuku simply made one of his genuine smiles, realizing how he wouldn't exchange this moment against anything, even the most precious jewels. Having his childhood friend's attention was his biggest pride, and falling for those charming crimson eyes was his biggest treasure he promised to cherish until his dying days. Wrong pawn because I thought you would handle it better than me, but I'm pretty sure the gossip about our little scene will keep these extras alive tomorrow, the blonde pointed out with an amused tone, slowly revealing more about his real self, something he hasn't done a long time ago. He rested his head against the transparent glasses, admiring the endless landscape near his reach and yet, so far from his touch, just like Izuku, who never stopped looking at him with this adoring expression on his face. Maybe the two of them were doomed to chase after an impossible love, but they didn't mind playing with the forbidden a little longer if this meant being alive for the first time in years. You're probably right, many of them found interest in our vulgar story. It's not like it was inspiring or brought something positive to their lives, he added with a slight chuckle, being self-aware about the ridiculous state of this situation. Their rivalry shouldn't have been a source of attention in the first place, being one among the thousands who already existed on this campus, but this pressure to fit into some social role to please some strangers ended up costing their humanity. Emerald eyes met the crimson ones, and a soft smile crossed his lips. The two men didn't need to talk to fill this blank in their short interaction, knowing it was already enough to stand by each other's side after so many years of wasted conflicts. After all, it was heartbreaking but realistic enough to picture a world where the two men took separate paths, found love with someone else, and got the happy ending they wanted. The simple representation of a vulgar stranger in their lover's arms was unbearable to their hearts, wondering if their other versions in this universe were sincerely happier or wore some fake mask to cover their mutual misery. You know, when we were young I used to start this kind of conversation so easily. I can't help but wonder if our relationship would have been different if we stayed the same while growing up, Izuku confessed with a nostalgic tone. His face brightened when he pictured, for a few seconds, the younger version of the blonde, with his crimson eyes and stubborn behavior, who never changed through the years. This heart-to-heart talk might be beneficial for both of them, Katsuki with the answers he deserves, and Izuku with his promises. I often miss my naivety about these kinds of things. Being an adult is harder than we thought, and there's no time to have a break, but it's also full of discovery. You don't need to force yourself. If there's anyone here who knows you better than you know yourself, it's me. Don't you think I never saw this Golden Age figurine you broke in my house by accident and you glued it with a poor trick? The taller man pointed out with an amused tone, catching the freckled man by surprise. Izuku was amazed to see how his childhood friend remembered this meaningless detail from their childhood, opening the conversation to more stories they used to keep hidden in the back of their minds. A sudden blush of embarrassment covered his cheeks, forcing him to cover his face in the pillow, under the touched crimson irises. It was sweet to see how the nerd didn't lose his natural charm, even if life forced him to make some difficult choices. His heart remained as pure as the naive child he met in his youth. I was 9 and felt guilty about it. I never wanted you to hate me for that, especially when it was one of your favorites. It was an accident, I swear. Izuku mumbled in his beard and swore on his life. He almost heard a slight laugh escaping the blonde's lips, but maybe it was all in his head. He recalled this memory like it was yesterday, with his shaking hands and the glue on the table, his heavy breath, and tears rolling down his freckled cheeks. That day, he let his curiosity take the lead and fall for the numerous collections standing within his reach, and his thumbs naturally tried to grab the Golden Age figurine, but the sound of the object falling on the floor gave him the scare of his life. He had never been so panicked, and did his best to glue the broken arms on the original body, hoping his best friend wouldn't leave him behind. Luckily, he succeeded in covering his crime at the last minute, but, much to his surprise, Katsuki explained how it was an old one and he planned to give it to Izuku for his birthday in July. If the younger Izuku felt bad about it, his current self was touched by the souvenirs. Katsuki had the occasion to ditch him and find another friend, but he chose to stay by his side and still offered the same figurine for his birthday, a few months later. To this day, this was probably the best present the freckled man ever received, and he kept it in his dorms once he moved to college, as a reminder of his roots and those tender memories he refused to leave behind in the next chapter of his life. Calm down, I'm just teasing you, idiot, the taller man affirmed with a slight grin, realizing how this must have been a sensitive topic for the nerd. If the two men were closer, Katsuki would have probably ruffled the messy green curls like the good old days, but he stopped himself from making the freckled man uncomfortable. I know you didn't have bad intentions and I didn't need your collective shirt as a way to forgiveness, but sometimes I tend to look in people's eyes and see how they stayed the same even if their faces became prettier. Izuku felt a slight rise of blush on his freckled cheeks at the previous comment, wondering if the last words were meant for him. Knowing Katsuki, the blonde had probably an idea in mind behind the choice of his comforting speech, but it might be a question to ask later. If the freckled man was moved by the mention of this shirt offered as a forgive me present, he never knew how the stubborn blonde kept it inside his closet as a tender memory of his precious past. He recalled the small note with Izuku's messy handwriting, the sad drawing of him asking for his forgiveness, and the "are we still best friends?" question. Back in the day, Katsuki immediately replied with his fingers playing with the messy curls, unaware of how this simple detail would haunt the rest of his life. I never wanted any of this, he confessed with a distant tone. The crimson eyes noticed how the small curls moved against the pillow when the freckled man turned his head at the breathtaking sky. Izuku always wondered if Katsuki and he would be able to observe the stars and their forms, talking about their stories, or creating some with their wild imaginations. Standing on this comfy bench with a pillow as emotional support wasn't in his plan, even when the blonde's glance was focused on him. A slight smile crossed his lips as he rubbed his thumbs against his pants, getting more relaxed at the personal intimacy between them. He almost forgot about the kiss they exchanged earlier in the night, being the main reason for their talk in the first place, but it was easier to mention the past and unspoken truths that had resided for too long at the tip of their lips. Katsuki was about to reply, but he was too stunned to speak when he caught the shorter man with this caring expression on his face, almost like he had something to hide. His heart missed a beat at the heartwarming view, being mesmerized by Izuku's enchanting eyes like a painter would be addicted to his muse and next creations. When I think about my childhood, I don't necessarily recall terrible moments, even if there have been some of them. I always feel relieved to know I had someone by my side to support each of my projects, even the craziest ones and failed sleepovers. I like hanging out with you, talking about our past, and laughing at some stupid memories we shared. Tell me, how did we end up in this fake rivalry? There was an ounce of sadness in the freckled man's tone, covering some tears that refused to fall on his porcelain skin. It was strange to hear the truth about their situation when they used to deny this statement for too long, but Izuku and Katsuki appreciated this moment of comprehension. Katsuki always wondered how the freckled man felt about this misunderstanding that caused too much damage, especially when he was used to his version of the story without taking a step further and asking about Izuku's. Seeing the shorter man expressing himself about this sensitive discussion comforted Katsuki's heart, even if he was convinced thousands of truths remained hidden at the moment. I have my reasons, but I'm pretty curious about yours, he whispered. I'm ready to take the risk, and I think we have a bunch of time left until someone looks for us, unless they're too wasted for that. Katsuki Bakugo might be rude and unbearable, but only Izuku Midoriya was able to see the sensitive side of his personality. They didn't need any words or proper conversation to understand each other's pain. Reading everything with a single glance was enough to appease the situation. The freckled man wanted to ask a bunch of questions concerning Katsuki's narrative about the same story, but he knew he'd share it once the time had come. However, it didn't stop him from releasing a slight laugh after the blonde's comment, catching the complete attention of the taller man beside him. The current setting was in their favor for a pleasing atmosphere, having the impression of being children laughing at silly jokes again. The two men genuinely missed those bonding moments, where their worlds became one and everything finally made sense to their shattered hearts. The two best friends finally reconnected in the blink of an eye and looked at each other as if they were their biggest pride. The sparkles rising inside their eyes were better than any praises they received from strangers until now, and yet, the distance between them made their desperate call unreachable. It was as rare as a gem to hear the genuine laugh of Katsuki Bakugo, who would rather lose himself in his curses and death threats than genuine weakness. Izuku didn't know he could feel so many emotions at once when he regained his breath and blushed at the gentle crimson eyes focused on him. During a moment, the freckled man's heart missed a beat as the calloused hands lost themselves in the golden spike, covered by the darkness of this midnight sky, which observed their heartwarming reunions. The invincible figure he created inside his mind the entire time was now replaced by the stubborn boy who used to hang out with him during summer afternoons, the one who reflected a relieved expression on his face. In all honesty, Katsuki didn't even know the last time he got a good laugh like this one. The joke wasn't necessarily funny, but the euphoria of the moment led them to act like children who had lost time. The emerald eyes never left his, too preoccupied by the secret messages transcribed in each of his glances, when their hearts begged for forgiveness. Everything was fine between us and suddenly we became distant for no reason, until we remained nothing but ashes in each other's lives and blurry frames of our past. It genuinely hurt me to watch my best friend and the person I trusted the most ignoring me. Where did I mess up, Kaken? He asked with a low tone, putting a lost curl behind his ear. His fingers ruffled the fabric of the pillow, holding it closer against his chest, under the understanding glance on the blonde's face. Izuku never thought he would have enough courage to free himself from this golden jail, but he had no regrets. It was evident how the unexpected question surprised the taller man, but Izuku was relieved to see how his assumptions about the blonde's reactions were nothing compared to real life. Katsuki stayed silent as he processed the previous interrogation, realizing how it was time to say his truths. Don't get him wrong, the taller man was terrified by the idea of rejection or misunderstanding, but Izuku's attention was focused on him and the nerd deserved to know the abrupt ending of this beloved friendship they care about. I know my wrongs, but I never had the courage to ask yours, he whispered with a sigh, resting his back against the wall. A groan escaped from his lips when he found the cold sensation against his shirt, forcing him to grab the closest pillow. His stoic behavior, who stayed distant since the beginning of the conversation, started to express some slight changes, discreet enough to be caught by the emerald eyes. but he didn't miss the way Izuku covered his smile from afar. Katsuki's heart missed a beat at this adorable sight and decided to continue his narrative, having enough courage to put those wasted years into words. In all honesty, my sudden change of behavior was caused by some rise of unknown feelings. It was hard for a young spirit like mine to get used to irreversible sentiments, especially when I never wanted to bring you into this downfall, especially when it transformed into an abrupt ending against our will, he explained with a sigh. I wanted to solve this on my own, and I thought it would be used to stand from afar rather than imposing some mixed-up feelings in this fragile thread between us. Back in the day, I was nothing but a brat who needed time to accept change, but I ended up losing the most precious treasures in the process, our friendship and your trust. As much as Katsuki wanted to make his perspective complete, he decided there was a clear distinction between a love confession and an explanation for ghosts of his past. It was unfair for the freckled man, who waited for this moment for years, only to have half of the story, but the less he confessed about his romantic feelings, the better it was for their situation. He glanced at the emerald eyes that looked at him with awe, almost like his previous speech was some kind of magical trick to steal the most curious souls in his narrative, when it was a simple reflection of his reality. Izuku stayed silent, understanding how he needed to process the previous information without jumping to the wrong conclusions. The first thing that crossed his mind was the official statement that his childhood friend never wanted to end their friendship on purpose, and it all happened by some random circumstances that appeared at the worst timing. If Izuku was the one to blame in the blonde's version, he would have mentioned it earlier, but instead, he continued with his speech that came straight from the heart, based on the slight change of tone in his voice. Despite his urge to erase his childhood friend's worries with a hug, he restrained himself from making the taller man uncomfortable but kept this idea in mind if things took a good turn at the end of the night. To be fair, it wasn't the explanation the green-haired man expected, but he wasn't complaining. The entire time, he prepared the worst of scenarios, with Katsuki being tired of him and moving on overnight, or Katsuki being interested in another path in life, and many similar theories. The only theory he got right was the fact that he was too shy to publicly acknowledge it, but Izuku was also the one to blame for making this friendship break up more naturally, and it was his biggest regret to this day. You never lost it, I just kept it hidden under strong layers in this role we've exposed to ourselves for so long, he confessed with a soft tone, moving closer to the taller figure. I do have to say, I admire your courage to stand up about this complicated PRD of our lives, and hearing your version of the story convinced me it was a stupid misunderstanding. May I ask what kind of feelings interfered with our relationship before graduation? If Katsuki wanted to push him away, Izuku wouldn't fight back and accept the distance, but he simply smiled in relief after seeing how the blonde accepted the gesture. Their bodies were now standing close enough to feel their knees meeting each other by accident, offering a clear depiction of this gorgeous painting. The crimson eyes stared at him with surprise, unsure about the reasoning behind the choice of the previous words, while Izuku's face softened at the scene. The kind of sentiment you can't put into words due to their intensity and impression of novelty. The same ones that never left me since that fateful day, unaware it would be our final conversation together before this mess. Katsuki's words sounded like a silent confession, melting Izuku's heart. At this moment, he recalled the previous exchange they had earlier in the drinking game, the way the strong grip brought him closer until their heated lips met and their bodies melted under each other's touch. During one moment, it was like their surrounding faded away, being replaced by the euphoria of this ethereal moment their hearts had begged all along, since their eyes met at the beginning of the party. At first, Izuku considered this option of having a mutual love as a dream too good to be true, but he was simply afraid. Afraid of falling harder for a man who would reject him at the slightest occasion, a shadow who'll mock him for falling for a cursed soul like his, and a ghost of his past haunting his dying days. Hearing Katsuki's version of the same story was odd, but refreshing enough to open his eyes about those years of misunderstanding that ruined this second chance they've been chasing the entire time. For the first time in a while, Izuku Midoriya had the impression of being loved by his childhood friend, bringing a slight blush to his face, even if the kiss needed to be mentioned a little later in their talk. Oh, I see, he simply mumbled with a gentle tone, moving closer to the blonde. On the outside, it wasn't a big step, but it represented a huge one for the two men who stood here, waiting for the next change in this fragile thread. Katsuki noticed. The way Izuku's fingers left the pillow to meet the blanket on the bench, he didn't say anything, opening a door to a potential secret gesture by exposing his cursed hands to this delicate soul that was Izuku's. "I did my job, now break the mystery, Freckles," teased the blonde with a slight grin. He wouldn't force this topic if the freckled man was distant, but the expression on Izuku's face transcribed his desire to end this stupid war after years of unsolved conflicts. However, if Katsuki used an ounce of humor in his previous answer, it wouldn't stop the blush on his porcelain skin, reminding him how the nerd's answer might or might not fit his assumptions. He needed to prepare himself for every explanation, including the most rational ones, even if it hurt to hear how Izuku was potentially bored of his presence. "It's fair for you to look forward to answers, and I'm here to give them to you. I have a bunch of apologies to share, but I hope your heart and soul will be forgiven enough to acknowledge my version of the story," the freckled man whispered with a low tone, ashamed of this part of the story he kept hidden for too long. It was strange to finally put into words this sensation that caused his downfall, even as a truth he kept hidden from his closest friends. Izuku wanted to let Katsuki be the only one to hear this version of the same narrative for the moment. "Depends if you'll start this tale one day or if I'm doomed to stay up until the sunrise dash." "That's mean." Izuku shared a soft laugh that escaped from his lips, losing his fingers on the taller man's shoulders. He felt at ease enough to share this important part of his past, with his old best friend by his side. If Katsuki simply rolled his eyes at the previous punch, he didn't fight back and waited until the freckled man felt appeased to continue his speech. However, his eyes didn't miss the slight smile appearing on his lips, the rare kind the nerd often used when he was genuinely relieved about something or someone. "I deserve it, but don't blame me for enjoying this conversation when I spent my entire time missing you and our friendship. I want to stay selfish and freeze time, but I know it won't be to your liking. If this means staying by your side, I wouldn't mind," the golden-haired man confessed, resting his back into a better position. He moved his knees closer to his chest and observed how the emerald eyes softened at the sight, taking a last glimpse at the breathtaking sky above their head before continuing his speech. Katsuki knew how tough this quest might be, especially after wasting so many years on misunderstandings, but he would be there to support the green-haired man if necessary. "I genuinely enjoyed our dynamic and late-night escape, where I had a safe place in these familiar dorms I started to know better than my own. I don't think I've regretted any of my souvenirs with you, but I noticed how you became more distant as time passed by," Izuku explained with a gentle tone, similar to a mother sharing a bedtime story to her children before sleeping. To be fair, this experience of sharing your heart against the unknown was scary, but he trusted his instincts and told him how Katsuki wouldn't let him down, and never had been, based on the understanding expression on his face. "At first, I was worried and tried to talk to you many times about it, but something always interfered with my attempts, until I gave up and hoped for change. When it became apparent to the most curious eyes, I convinced myself it was probably due to this desire for novelty, something you can't have if you're stuck with me." Katsuki stayed silent, realizing how wrong his assumptions had been since the beginning. He should have asked about it earlier instead of thinking his childhood friend was hating him for no reason, but the blonde was dealing with this sudden rise of romantic feelings, and each gesture started to be interpreted differently. It would be a lie to pretend he didn't miss their bedtime together, the way those scarred fingers always found their way into his hands, and messy curls falling asleep on the delicate sound of his heartbeat. Their younger selves never appreciated the beauty of this moment until it was too late, and their home was out of reach, belonging to the past in those narratives that started to gather dust with the other. Their biggest fear was to see those lines, marked by an indelible ink, fading into ashes at the end of this journey, but their mutual affection toward these common and secret fights kept this invisible string alive. In all honesty, if Katsuki was bored of something or someone, he would have immediately let the other know, but with Izuku? He could spend thousands of lifetimes chasing after him and listening to his stories, but he'll never get bored with it. At first, he put the blame on his romantic feelings for changing his perception, but it didn't mean those previous gestures weren't meant to be one-sided. It was Izuku who sneaked out of his dorms to sleep with Katsuki after a nightmare, It was Katsuki who reassured the freckled man during the tough days, and so many more souvenirs that forged this indelible thread between them. The presence of love only opened the possibility of a new ending and chapter to explore once they were ready. It had never been an opponent but a guide. I understood your choice, and stayed supportive until I decided to make this easier for you, Izuku explained in a low tone, holding the tissue of the pillow tighter. The crimson eyes noticed the presence of hidden tears at the corner of his eyes, being admirative to see the shorter man's courage. I don't really know when I started to accept this reality, but it started to hurt like hell when I had no one to comfort me during my nightmare and nowhere to go. I should have fought a little longer and convinced you to let you stay by my side, but I was so afraid of losing you. I thought that being away from me was the happiness you always wanted. Izuku Midoriya was an angel ready to sacrifice his own life to protect the innocent, even if this meant breaking the hearts of his loved ones and surroundings. It was evident how having a knight like him by his side was great luck, and a source of envy for the most corrupted souls, but hearing Izuku's reasoning was heartbreaking. They should have seen it coming, and yet, he was forced to see the effort of holding back his tears to avoid a breakdown. Katsuki always loved the nerd's presence by his side, no matter the age and the state of their relationship, and seeing the freckled man considering that distance could solve this issue was heart-wrenching. If this was the explanation the taller man had been looking for, why did he feel so empty and impacted at the idea that Izuku only started his version of the story and there was still so much more to learn? That's stupid, the entire building knew about us being close friends since diapers. Why would I get rid of you overnight? Katsuki pointed out with a slight tease, punching the other's shoulders in soft movements. He didn't want to scare the freckled man, especially when he looked so fragile under this angle, but it was Katsuki's goal to let him shorter how it was all in his head. However, both men felt a certain relief at the idea that this abrupt separation wasn't caused by negative emotions like hate, but by something more delicate and a lack of communication. They have no idea what they would have done if their narrative were summarized by a stupid misunderstanding, justified by this impression being a bother, but luckily, it wasn't and will never be the case, based on the caring expression on their faces. The taller man decided to break this invisible barrier between them, surprising the shorter figure beside him. The calloused hands made a simple gesture to let him know how he could join him. A simple action on the outside but a meaningful one for the freckled man, who recognized this glance everywhere. His face softened when he agreed to put his insecurities down for a while, moving closer enough to his childhood friend's shoulders to rest his head against them. Katsuki didn't fight back when he found the shorter man in this comfortable position, giving up the previous pillow to lose his thumbs against the blonde's shirt, reminding him of their late night, full of talk about their future. Izuku smiled when he felt the hesitant fingers ruffling his messy curls. He started to feel his slight breath against his skin. I should have stopped this misunderstanding, but let's be real. If my what-ifs became true, how would you react? The freckled man asked with a curious tone, knowing it was an important question to mention. After all, being realistic might calm down the voices in their heads exposing their flaws, the same details that caught the other's heart in the most breathtaking way. At this moment, Katsuki realized that he didn't even know the answer to this scenario. He never considered having a second chance back in the day due to potential rejection, especially with his harsh personality when he was confronted with the unknown. The only thing that mattered to him at the moment was the sensation of Izuku's curls meeting his chin by accident, scarred fingers holding his clothes with ease, and the tender weight against his body. He used to pray for nights like these, where the two men were sharing the same universe once again, and each truth would resonate as a delicate melody to their ears, but he never expected this unreachable dream to become his new reality. Probably suffering in silence and staying distant. So yeah, maybe time was something necessary to figure things out, but it's not too late to give the apologies we deserve, don't you think? He asked with an understanding tone, one he usually keeps for the people he cares about the most. Izuku Midoriya had been the only name in this list since the very beginning, from their amazing friendship to the new perception of love between their interaction. Katsuki didn't want to die without regrets, and no matter the outcome of the night, he knew he would never forgive this moment, written with indelible ink in those charming pages of their narratives. Izuku unconsciously moved his head to find a more comfortable position, until he ended up being guided by those calloused and protective hands. His messy curls naturally found the other's lap, and his scarred fingers lost themselves in the air until their hands intertwined. The sudden sensation of their skin meeting each other brought a slight smile to their face, with a rising blush on Izuku's cheeks and a smirk on the blonde's lips. Their fingers naturally held each other with a hesitant gesture, afraid to break the other's boundaries, until those delicate movements became confident enough to meet together. The freckled man peacefully rested there, with the charming crimson eyes looking at him with genuine care, a breathtaking picture that Izuku wanted to mesmerize until his dying breath. "I've been waiting for this moment for years," he confessed in a small tone, afraid to let the wind steal this moment away from their tender reunion. None wanted to explain how they ended up here, with a position clear enough to anyone entering this secret spot by accident, but they didn't care. The only thing that mattered to them at the moment was the reconnection between their souls, almost like the previous years didn't erase the strong bond that transformed this friendship into the most inspiring tale. The emerald eyes never stopped looking at the enchanting ones of his childhood friend, falling harder for this reassuring figure that brought him the best care in the world, even since they were young enough to not know anything about love. "Kaken, I'm so sorry for breaking our promises. You have the right to hate me, but now I have a second chance and I refuse to let it go. You have no idea how much I missed you. I should be the one apologizing for my actions, but now that I fully acknowledge this sentiment that guided me through the years, I'm ready to accept this offer," he whispered with an understanding tone, being relieved to get rid of those layers of fear that separated him from his genuine delight. "It would be a lie to say I was doing all right on my own when I missed your stupid head the entire time. This rivalry was stupid, but at least it opened our eyes to this mutual fear of losing each other. I don't really know what to expect from us in the near future, but let's try to handle it together like we always did." The calloused hands left the smaller ones to lose themselves in the messy curls, under the unmistakable scarlet color rising on those freckled cheeks. The darkness of the night might steal a bunch of shade from this amazing scene, but the crimson eyes were focused on the work of art within his reach, too precious to be broken by a simple touch, but beautiful enough to stuck the most curious eyes. Being this close to his childhood friend was a dream too good to be true, but the blush at the tip of his ears brought him back to reality. Everyday life he was ready to accept if this means being loved by his other half. Izuku couldn't help but release a genuine smile, able to blind anyone who stared at this work of art for too long. He had never felt cherished and protected by someone who used to be his safe place in the darkest moments, and the shoulder to cry on. At this moment, the freckled man didn't even hesitate about the evident statement that crossed his heart when he realized how he was ready to take the world down to stand by Katsuki's side, even if this meant being against the public opinion of this new form of love. He felt his body melting under the strong hands, ruffling his curls with enough care to make him smile wilder at the joy rising inside his chest, wishing to freeze time and wake up in the blonde's warmth and tender embrace for the rest of his life. "I'm glad to have someone like you in my life," he confided, with shining irises. He never thought he would have enough courage to make such a confession after those wasted tears, but Izuku was relieved to feel close to this important figure of his past, who would become his new present and tender future. "This world might have thousands of shadows trying to get my attention, but none will be able to replace my Kaken." The golden-haired man didn't need to be blind to see the secret hints indirectly thrown at him, even when the emerald eyes looked at him as if he were the prettiest jewel in the box. There was something captivating about the way their two souls, distinct on many layers, succeeded in creating a common world with their differences. This universe at the palm of their hands might be imperfect, but it was their biggest pride and best creation, being the beginning of a new series that'll compose the next prose of their favorite poems. "I wish I could return the compliment, but your ego will be too strong for the night," Katsuki affirmed with a grin, hearing the soft song of Izuku's laugh across the room. The centimeters separating them were enough to feel the SXL tension between them, the same sentiment of déjà vu that crossed their chest during their drinking game earlier. As much as they tried to avoid the topic and focus on old souvenirs, those frames never left their minds, acting like a reminder of their physical actions that might have consequences on their relationship. Seeing Izuku's charming face was all Katsuki ever wanted, and he could already imagine the pink-haired woman being a mess after hearing the news about this sudden proximity, going from 0 to 100 in a few hours. However, Izuku decided it was the perfect time to return back to their roots, with a meaningful gesture that represented an important part of their past. Against his will, he decided to leave the taller man's lap to sit right in front of him, exposing his blushing cheeks to the charming irises of his childhood friend. The breeze ruffled the lost curls against his forehead, meeting the heavy differences between the warmth of Katsuki's hands and the real life awaiting him at the end of the night, but Izuku didn't mind. He didn't hesitate before pushing his pinky finger in the close distance between them, catching the surprised crimson eyes, which slowly turned into a softer expression. "Promise me we won't repeat our past mistakes," he whispered, his voice highlighting the rise of hope that suddenly grew inside his chest. Izuku's shattered heart was now filled with genuine happiness and desire to stay here as long as possible until the sun rose from the unreachable landscape from afar. His heart missed a beat when he felt the taller man agreeing to his childish request, despite their big age and the previous scene they've caused. "Only if you're honest about your own feelings," Katsuki replied with a grin at the tip of his lips, letting his pinky finger meet the smaller ones, turning their previous conversation into an ethereal promise of a new beginning. At this moment, a few frames from their childhood started to appear like old movies, picturing two children having the time of their lives with endless pinky promises. The strongest ones remained the most discreet when the rainy storms scared the blonde boy and his best friend promised to chase the nightmare away, or the moment when Izuku had a terrible dream about losing the person he loved the most. The two shadows might have grown up too fast for this world, but their souls remained as authentic as their younger selves, with a naive dream and a desire to chase after each other in every universe. "What do you mean?" Izuku asked with a confused tone. He wondered what the blonde had in mind to point out such an important detail like this one. A bunch of theories and questions crossed his mind, from the most reasonable to the most chaotic ones, but he wasn't prepared for the next answer. Catching him off guard about this topic, he tried to cover with simple laughs and bad jokes. "This kiss wasn't the result of a drunken action, right?" If the freckled man was aware of Katsuki's feelings, at least this impression he got from his speech earlier, he never expressed himself about his current situation. Don't get him wrong, Izuku Midoriya was in love with his childhood friend and refused to give his heart to another stranger who would never be as impressive as Katsuki Bakugo. If he was honest with himself, he would have already admitted the reason behind this sudden kiss that shocked both men during their games earlier, but he waited for the right timing. Now the occasion presented itself to develop and make this love confession he had planned for years. He ended up being hesitant, sending the wrong signals to the blonde, who waited for a proper answer. Izuku wished he could find the right words to describe the rising emotions inside his chest and the delight he felt once his lips met the blonde's. The simple reminder that Katsuki stopped him on purpose before replying to his kiss was something the freckled man considered an unreachable dream, but once it became his reality, his entire world fell apart. He was understanding of the efforts the blonde put into his previous speech, but he naturally questioned himself about the options within his reach. Try to give a shot to another step of their relationship, or pretend to stay friends with secret feelings for each other. This game lasted for too long, and the only thing Izuku wanted was to stop being haunted by ghosts of his past and embrace his present and future, especially with this reassuring figure supporting him from afar. No matter if Katsuki either accepts or rejects his confession, he wants to keep his childhood friend by his side at all costs. "It's complicated," he explained with a sigh, looking at the curious crimson eyes. "Before our conversation, I would have denied their existence for the sake of our friendship, being more important than some romantic interest in this bond, fragile enough to break with a single mistake. However, seeing you exposing your truths and having this ounce of courage I've been looking for reminded me of how unfair it was to keep this affection one-sided." "I don't get what you mean," Katsuki added with a serious tone. He might have joked around a few topics earlier in the conversation, but he knew he wouldn't make a stupid tease when it came to romantic feelings. The blonde didn't want to impose his mindset, but a single glance between them was enough to understand the importance of this conversation. He appreciated the praise from the nerd and the gorgeous expression on his face, but they couldn't avoid this conversation for too long. I appreciate our friendship, a lot, but it's not enough, and I might have lied about a part of the reason for me being distant in our high school days. It's unfair to keep this truth when you've been the one who needed a proper answer, and leaving on a misunderstanding might be worse than putting into words the truths I should have said earlier, the green-haired man confided with a sigh, closing his fingers against the blanket. The atmosphere in the room was now highlighted by the hesitation in the choice of Izuku's words, making sure everything was correct to not break Katsuki's trust, or lead to wrong conclusions. After all, they've both shared a tender moment earlier, and it probably motivates Izuku for the rest of the conversation, exposing his love for his childhood friend. I accepted this decision of taking a separate path because I wanted your happiness, more than anything, even if this had a huge price on my side. A part of me held on to the hope of getting a second chance, even if my feelings were mostly driven by another desire, something I've kept hidden with the hope to be the last souvenir of our bond. Silence filled the room as the two men stood on the blanket, catching the last songs in the background caressing their sensitive ears. The only details that caught their attention were the meaningful expressions on each other's faces, transcribing each of their thoughts with a single glance, and Izuku's slight moments of hands against his shirt. Katsuki recognized this habit too easily to realize how the freckled man was probably panicking with the thousands of theories crossing his mind. His body moved closer to the shorter man, losing his fingers in the exposed shoulders and catching Izuku's attention. As much as he hated this sight, the blonde had no other choice but to be a spectator of this cruel show, hoping this amount of support would be enough to let Izuku know he was safe. The freckled man held back his tears and welcomed the calloused fingers against his skin. He wanted to rush into the blonde's chest, hold his taller figure tighter, and apologize for being so stupid, but it was useless. Katsuki was looking at him with comprehension until his strong fingers met the messy curls to play with them. This gesture brought the shorter man back to the good old days when a magical kiss on the cheeks and his knee injuries were enough to bring a smile back to his face. No matter how many times he tried to convince himself, Izuku Midoriya deserved to stand by Katsuki Bakugo's side, as a friend, lover, or shadow in the background. You've been the best friend I could ever ask for, the confidant I needed the most when I was at my lowest, and my biggest hero. When I think about reassuring figures of my childhood, I picture you with your stupid grin and confidence that were unreachable for my age, until this admiration transformed into something else, a deeper meaning, he confessed with a low tone, afraid to be caught by the curious ears from afar. They couldn't be interrupted, knowing it was only the two of them in the room, but Izuku felt pressured by the wind muffling against his ears. He could hear this mocking laugh about realizing his feelings too late, being the burden in this relationship, and ruining everything he dared to touch. His curiosity became a source of pain and conflict, even when the man he loved was worried about his state. After all, it was strange to see the freckled man being so open about his heart and deepest fears, but Katsuki was glad he was the one to support him at this precious moment. His fingers continued to ruffle the messy curls, until the shorter man lifted his head and decided to continue his speech, being glad someone was here to listen to his rant. Suddenly, all our interactions became more important than the others, each glimpse made me feel a heat on my cheeks, and those nights by your side became my everything. When you took your distance, I was inconsolable, haunted by some monster that reminded me of how I lost my other half by letting you go. I thought I would be able to heal, but it took me a few months before realizing how this pain won't go away, not unless I accepted this new feeling inside my chest. If Katsuki stayed silent, he slowly proceeded with the previous revelations. His heart missed a beat at the idea that Izuku Midoriya, the man he had loved since a young age, might return his feelings. He wanted to consider this as his happy ending, but he needed more explanation about this conflict inside the nerd's chest. After all, the shorter man wasn't easy to read, but once he gave the keys to his secret garden, he knew everything would be possible, including the occasion to read the delicate poems transcribed through his shining irises. It was easy to get addicted to those adorable freckles on his cheeks, his delicate laugh, affectionate scars, and the gorgeous painting that was his breathtaking face. Katsuki wasn't the first one to fall into this trap, but he remained the strongest soldier for surviving this long with hidden sentiments, forced to watch his childhood friend from afar. However, the golden-haired man started to feel an ounce of hope for their future, especially after the bonding time they recovered and the confessions that healed their shattered hearts. This familiarity in the nerd's speech gave him the sensation of déjà vu, almost like he was reliving his high school years with his low. You mean? Kaken, I realized my mistakes too late, and yet I think I understand your situation better, Izuku explained with a smile, moving his thumbs to catch the spiky hair in gentle movements. As strange as it seemed, the green-haired man started to feel at ease with this situation, even if he was afraid of the other's reaction, but he would rather live without regrets than give his last breath without telling his childhood friend how much he loved him. It was a sensation as ethereal as the beauty of their old souvenirs, an unknown impression of reliving his favorite tale with distinct settings and characters, but the same enchanting spells residing at the tip of Katsuki's lips. The blonde might be harsh to the other, but none really know about Katsuki's fear of rainy days, how it might change his mood into a sadder one, or the way his calloused hands held Izuku's shirt closer when he's afraid or anxious about something. It was the beauty of those small but amazing moments that convinced the freckled man to keep fighting, even if he was meant to fail. At least he knew he did his best until the very end. I think your feelings are pretty similar to mine, with the same intensity and wasted confessions that transcribe into desperate gestures when the occasion shows up at our door. It took me a while before accepting it, but I've never stopped looking down, even with this new vision of each of your stupid smirks, charming eyes, and courage able to inspire the youngest. So yeah, no matter what assumptions you've made about this kiss, you were wrong. Katsuki was speechless. He felt the way his mouth barely opened to release a sudden breath after the slap he received in the face, realizing how none of this was the result of his desperate imagination. The man he loved returned his feelings and let him know it was mutual, some tricks he would never have thought possible until now, but he needed to thank the stars for making his prayers real. The taller man was smart enough to distinguish the hints, which he had previously done after this impression of déjà vu, that might lead to only one road possible. But seeing Izuku blushing with hidden tears at the corner of his lips was too ethereal for his reach. He wished he could transcribe each of his emotions into prose that would define this timeless poem in the palm of his hand, staying as impressive as the owners who created this work of art. Izuku and Katsuki weren't sure of the narrative they'd share in the next decades, but they didn't have an ounce of regret, especially when their love was the most breathtaking treasure they cherished. I was relieved to know our conflict was finally over, and before realizing it, my body moved on its own to celebrate this news. I did feel guilty for stealing this moment from your journey with someone else, but when you returned the gesture, I thought that maybe I would let myself go and transcribe those unshared feelings into an unforgettable gesture, Izuku confessed with a soft tone, wondering if he should cry with relief at the gentle crimson eyes near his reach. He hadn't seen his childhood friend in such a state for a long time, but his heart cherished this moment more than any victories or praises he had gained until now. When the other shadows were fitting into this false mask to get the public's attention, Izuku only needed to wear his gorgeous smile to steal one heart, the one who'll gladly return his feelings. The freckled man had a hard time believing how he did all of this by himself, but he couldn't be prouder, especially when Katsuki looked at him with such gentleness, able to make the shorter man fall a third time for this reassuring figure. You were sincere the entire time, Katsuki whispered in a low tone, regaining his breath. A hint of red colored his cheeks, exposed under the amused emerald eyes, which shared the most adorable glance he had ever seen. The previous hesitation was now replaced by this strong connection between them, those hidden smiles and secret handholds they wished to have sooner, instead of chasing after the wrong fight. The two childhood friends had some trouble, but those years of mutual pining never erased the mutual care they had for each other. On the contrary, it made this sentiment stronger than it already was, transforming this touching narrative into a timeless fairy tale for the most curious souls. There was no doubt Katsuki Bakugo loved his childhood friend more than his own life, but Izuku Midoriya was ready to return the gesture if this meant spending the rest of his life with his other half. I've always been, but feeling you so close to me brought me back to this past I cherished more than my own life. I drowned in this selfish pleasure I never thought I would experience one day, and before realizing it was over, and I wanted more. he whispered with a fond tone, losing his fingers into the blonde's arms, slowly tracing the presence of scars he recognized anywhere. The gesture was delicate enough to bring chills to the blonde's body, noticing how Katsuki held his breath at the few centimeters between them. He loved how those tender thumbs found their way into this brushed skin, who already faced too many terrors at his young age needed a savior. Izuku had always been the shoulder to cry on, the one to stand by his side when the blonde was at his lowest, and seeing Katsuki blushing at the gesture brought a grin back to Izuku's face. He let his fingers slowly move on purpose against his skin, catching the change of expression in the crimson eyes, until his thumbs found the evident scars and moved closer. The taller man held his breath and welcomed the shorter figure into his personal space, as the curious fingers made their way into the other's neck, captivating enough to have the blonde's complete attention. More of your smile, more of your strong hands against my body, more of your charming eyes reading into mine. I was genuinely happy for a few seconds, where I had the impression you were mine and our world collapsed together. It's stupid, right? The only stupid thing was to predict the reason for my drunk actions when you didn't know any of it. I know my values. I'm not the kind of guy to do something he doesn't like, Katsuki replied with a confident tone, bringing a slight grin to the corner of Izuku's lips. He liked being the center of the freckled man's attention and the only name leaving his lips and the source of those sparkles inside those charming irises. If he could, the blonde would gladly become Izuku's biggest treasure to be cherished by his protective hands until his final breath, but he needed to return the gesture first. In order to make this dream come true, he was obligated to use words to let the nerd understand how it was mutual, something he didn't understand based on the surprised expression on his face. You spent the last minutes talking about how you feel and how selfish it was, but I don't see anything wrong here. To me, I'm just seeing the man I loved and chased after for so long, offering me his love on a silver plate with the most breathtaking promises on his lips. If you're the bad guy, I'm the worst for replying to your kiss and letting you know how this was mutual, but can we really consider ourselves monsters if our actions are dictated by love? He asked as if it was the most obvious question when Izuku's face turned redder at the meaning. He noticed how the delicate fingers were now hesitant once they met the fabric of the blonde's shirt, like he wanted to have the confirmation he wasn't dreaming. Katsuki wanted to laugh at how adorable this scene was, especially the realization crossing the emerald eyes, that charmed the blonde's corrupted soul a long time ago. If the taller figure stayed silent, he observed how Izuku's face turned into different emotions at once, from surprise to the realization, until it became softer with previous tears. You said you love me, is that true? The shorter man asked with a heavy breath, wishing to stay in this wonderful dream. It was a strange impression. He got everything he ever wanted, but he had the sentiment of missing something, a last detail that would complete this breathtaking puzzle and start this new beginning. Izuku Midoriya might have a lot of things to learn from life, but he wouldn't mind committing errors and being reassured by those strong arms around his waist after each waste of tears on his porcelain skin. His heart missed a beat when he connected the dots with Katsuki's speech about his motives and the previous confession, bringing a sudden blush that reached the tip of his ears. He used to predict each decision and its consequences, but he was far from those shocking revelations based on an innocent kiss during some drinking game. I fell in love with you when we were brats, but it became obvious in our high school years. It explains why I was projecting in my own mind a situation that'll never happen, according to my younger self. He explained with a soft tone, moving his thumbs into the messy curls, ruffling them with a gentle slide, before losing his fingers behind the freckled man's ears. Izuku held his breath, feeling his heated cheeks being welcomed by the calloused hands that slowly moved against his skin, cupping his freckled cheeks like the work of art he represented to his eyes. The hands that used to throw middle fingers were cherishing this fragile skin, such as those lips, which used to curse many names and ended up selling tender promises in the middle of the night. I don't regret falling for you when each of your laughs echoes as a tender melody to my ears, when your messy curls remind me of this fresh morning, or when you have this stupid smile with your chubby cheeks that immediately melts my heart. My biggest regret is waiting so many years to admit it out loud, but I knew I didn't need to say more when you kissed me back. Izuku didn't know he was crying until his vision became blurry from the tears. Those intense emotions only resulted from the too much pressure he kept on his shoulders since the beginning of the conversations, his unspoken fears, and the relief of knowing this hell was over. No more conflict between them, only love and care between their new dynamic and a second chance they'll cherish more than their own lives. The presence of delicate fingers against his cheeks didn't make this easier for his poor heart, even when Izuku naturally moved his head into the touch, melting on the spot. He was ready to show his darkest secret to be cherished by those strong fingers against his exposed body, loved by those lips that marked their territory against his earlier, and by delicate promises that echoed as timeless vows on the altar. There was no doubt that Izuku Midoriya was down bad for his childhood friend, and seeing the stubborn blonde returning this treasure, still untouched until now, was a miracle. I understand, love is scary, but I know I'm making the right choice by having you as my lifetime partner. We've known each other since birth, and I won't let you go, even if you pay me thousands of yen. I'll chase after you in every lifetime, make sure your heart and soul will be mine in each of them, and be the one to hold your hands in your last breath. Consider me crazy, but I didn't see this kiss as a drunken mistake, but a sign of fate to start again. Now the final decision is on you, Katsuki whispered against each other's ear, burning chills to Izuku's body. The freckled man closed his eyes when he let the strong hands bring his body closer, with a few centimeters separating their lips. He was ready to scream to the world how lucky he was to have someone as mesmerizing as Katsuki Bako for the rest of his life, but he wanted to be selfish first. I was your first kiss, he mumbled, moving his face close enough until their eyes met. The sight was as gorgeous as the author of this delicate song that echoed inside his heart, with these adoring crimson eyes and tender lips that seemed so out of reach and captivating at the same time. It was natural to feel guilty for his previous actions, but the taller man seemed to turn this situation to his advantage. And I wouldn't mind having a second one, Katsuki repeated with a gentle tone, losing his fingers inside the freckled man's back. Izuku held his breath and welcomed the touch, trying to convince the blonde about his evident mistakes, and maybe Katsuki would change his mind before falling too hard for someone like him, full of flaws. I stole this moment from someone else. I would refuse any attempts coming from anyone. Your lips are the only ones I want to feel against mine until my dying days, he answered with an amused tone, enjoying how the shorter man relaxed himself at the delicate touch against his skin. Izuku was grateful to have an oversized shirt, letting those welcoming fingers meet his back and naked skin, trying to send a message. He wanted to drown in this pleasure and shut the other down with a kiss, but he had a promise to keep, bring his childhood friend back to his reason. You don't understand, this is unfair and I was selfish, the freckled man pointed out with a serious tone, even when the blonde's fingers lift his chin to get his complete attention. He was about to fall all over again, but he needed to stay strong. I like how selfishness brought us closer and exposed some truths we were too scared to admit. Izuku, look at me, do you love me? The question was simple, and the answer naturally escaped from Izuku's lips, much to his surprise. I do more than anything, he confessed with a low tone, discreet enough to be heard by Katsuki's ears and erased from the wind's gossip. He moved closer to the taller man, until their forehead rested against each other, feeling their heavy breath and tension rising between their touch. Izuku liked how his childhood friend tried to defend his reasoning until the end, convincing the shorter man to give up his defense and melt into the safest arms near his reach. He was a weak soldier when it came to love, but he wouldn't mind belonging to Katsuki Bakugo's heart for the rest of his life. Then shut your brain off and be mine until death do us part. The proposition sounded so tempting on the blonde's lips, especially when they're already shared a bunch of new promises earlier. Izuku Midoriya followed his heart and fell for this temptation that corrupted his soul with a simple glance of his opponent, who knew it had been a victory since the beginning. After all, Katsuki knew it would be hard to fully convince the nerd about this happy ending at the palm of their hands, but it was better than being alone with some of his darkest thoughts. Kaken, that's dash. Izuku didn't even have time to finish his sentence, being shut down by Katsuki's lips against his. The sensation of déjà vu was reassuring enough to melt the freckled man into this river of selfish pleasure, losing his scarred fingers around the other's neck. He knew it was bad and he needed to fight harder to make this situation fair for their both corrupted hearts, but he was too tired at the moment. The only thing he wanted to feel was the delicate lips searching after his gentle movements, tasting this rising sensation inside his chest until he released his first noise. His scarred fingers, previously wrapped around Katsuki's hands, were now moving inside his golden spiky hair until they held him closer enough to deepen their kiss. It was a missed occasion. They didn't have the chance to experience it earlier due to the crowd and their surroundings, but when they were on their own, the boundaries were quickly forgotten. Izuku's fingers grabbed the spiky hair closer enough to bring the taller man back to him, gliding their bodies together as their heavy breath mixed together. At this moment, all the previous anxiety and doubts faded away, being replaced by the loving mouths cherishing each other as the rhythm of their favorite song. Each step they took against each other's skin was promised to this indelible poem written with the best of ink against those blank pages, such as the slight gasp that escaped from their lips once they separated for a few seconds. It didn't take long until their mouths collapsed together again, this time in more gentle kisses as Katsuki's hands moved to hold Izuku's waist closer, while his fingers held the messy curls tighter. The freckled man smiled through the heated encounter, opening his mouth to release some space and naturally welcomed the blonde's tongue, while their world became one in the most essential ways. This simple gesture and acceptance transformed their vulnerable bodies into heated ones, sensitive to each gesture, chills and words whispered between their heavy breath, as the two men tasted each other like their lives were on the line. This romantic gesture turned into years of unsolved conflicts, opening the door to new feelings rising inside their bodies as their tongues kept dancing with each other until they separated against their will to catch their breath, with a bunch of saliva. Izuku wouldn't mind melting into this ethereal sensation for the rest of his lips, opening his secret garden to this corrupted soul that charmed his sensitive irises since the first day. If selfishness wasn't a crime, the shorter man wasn't against the idea of offering his soul to those tempting lips who offered so many treasures until now, covered by the reflections of a heartbeat beating at the same rhythm in this heated interaction. The emerald eyes stared at the crimson ones, his scarred fingers cupping his childhood friend's cheeks as he rested his forehead against his. Katsuki accepted the tender gesture, holding the freckled man closer until a smile crossed their lips, feeling relieved and alive for the first time in years. I think I'll have a hard time accepting this new reality, but I wouldn't mind catching the lost time with you if you let me be a part of your world, Izuku whispered with a soft tone, melting when those strong fingers wrapped around his waist. He refused to escape from this welcoming grip, especially when his feelings were finally returned after so many years of wrong assumptions and false hope. We both know the answers, he teased with an amused grin at the corner of his lips. The world might try to set obstacles on their path, but it'll never break this indelible bond the two men forged since their first glances, unaware of the crazy journey they'll experience for the rest of their lives. After all, there was no need to have other experiences when they were each other's biggest pride, even with the unspoken truths and secrets the two men needed to discover in the next years. I want you to say it. This might be a stupid request, but Izuku insisted on hearing those words leaving the blonde's lips, the same ones he kissed a few seconds ago. Please, Kaken. The memories warmed his cheeks, and the blonde took advantage to catch the freckled man off guard. Izuku didn't fight back when gentle fingers caressed his cheeks and lost themselves behind his ears, making him smile at the delicateness of the touch. His childhood friend was hesitant to discover this part of his body when the shorter man was ready to spend an entire lifetime teaching each of his favorite and most sensitive spots to the blonde without an ounce of guilt. Fine, but I'll only say it once tonight, he murmured with a stuck tone, catching the gentle laugh escaping the other's lips. Katsuki wanted to be mad at the reaction, but he simply accepted his fate and faced the amused expression on his lover's face, transcribing each line as the most breathtaking lyrics their hearts had ever seen. Such a gentleman, Izuku teased, wrapping his arms around the blonde's neck. He will never get used to this sensation of belonging to the right place at the right time, but he counts on his childhood friend, and very soon-to-be boyfriend to be a good teacher. I'll kick your butt once we leave this house, Freckles. Izuku simply replied with another chuckle that echoed as a melody to the taller man's ears. He wouldn't wish for a better ending with the love of his life, looking at him with such care and gentleness. He wanted to freeze time and stay in this embrace forever, but knew tomorrow would be a good day. His hand lost itself on the top of his head, catching the loving irises, and the blonde followed the lead by expressing out loud what he kept hidden for too long. I love you. The stubborn head, hated by the others and admired by some, succeeds in revealing a more vulnerable part of his soul. The moon and curious stars might spread the news of their ethereal reunion, but this new beginning only brought more hope into their chest, refusing to leave this embrace that'll define the rest of their lives. Their journey as a couple just started, but as longtime friends, Izuku and Katsuki naturally continued their favorite narratives. I love you too, Izuku Midoriya, this unreachable figure of his past, confessing such adoring words to his ears was unbelievable. However, the blonde chose to reply with a simple grip on the smaller body against his, catching the loving irises. Izuku's glance never left his, even when he rested his forehead against the nerd's and felt their free hands interlaced together. This time, they shouldn't be afraid of the future, not when they finally find their home. Is this real? The freckled man asked in a low tone. The green curls easily found their place against the blonde's chest, melting at the loving lullaby of his heartbeat against his ears, until his own heart felt at ease. His fingers held the blonde's thigh, before moving his knuckles to his lips and dropping a gentle mark against her porcelain skin. Only if you want it to be, nerd. The answer was simple but efficient enough to convince the shorter man to stay a little longer in this embrace. It didn't take long until the two men found a better position, with Izuku's head resting against his lover's chest, fingers drawing circles against his skin, and calloused fingers ruffling the top of his head. Izuku and Katsuki started to get used to this new dynamic, as they started to recall their past souvenirs, sharing laughs and explanations, mixed with apologies until discreet kisses started to lose themselves in the conversation. None of them realized how they started to fall asleep until the background music was turned off, with background noises from afar. The sunrise started to show its brightest colors, revealing its secret to the most curious souls. Last night, Mina and Ochako trusted their friends with this important conversation, but it was their duty to check on them and panic once they got out of reach. The two women allied to find their secret spot until their research led to an interesting sight. Despite the capacity of the bench, the two figures resided here, holding each other as close as possible, with a relaxed expression on their faces. The scarred fingers easily found their way into his lover's shirt, resting his sleepy head closer to his chest with a slight smile when Katsuki's fingers stayed beside the messy curls, which became his source of comfort after the event of the last night. The blanket was comfy enough to cover half of Izuku's body, with a pillow that saved Katsuki's neck from intolerable pain, but none of it seemed to bother the sleeping figures. The two women shared an understanding glance at the scene, realizing how there'll be a lot to talk about once those two idiots woke up from their nap.